Pam, could we get a roll call, please?
Here.
Ryan Slack.
Here.
Jackie Whitson.
Here.
Katie Schwer. Here. Bill Infante.
Here.
Auden Schendler.
Here.
Jennifer Riffle is absent this evening.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Okay, our first item is our best item, which is our awards for the Students of the Month. And this month, we are honoring trustworthiness. And that is defined as being honest, not deceitful, not cheating or stealing, being reliable, do what you say you'll do, which is a great thing, have the courage to do the right thing, build a good reputation, be loyal, and stand by your family and friends. And the students who get these awards also get a pass to the Basalt Pool for the summer. So with that, I will ask if maybe Gary would like to start.
Sure. We got Marianne Gonzalez.
Did Marianne make it?
No.
Not yet.
Okay,
We can
well,
try
hold
her
on.
at the end, yeah. And see.
You're up.
I have Hayden Perlman.
Yeah, Hayden. You gotta come up.
You come up here, little big man.
You can just stand right here.
How's it going?
Good.
Nice to meet you. Great job. Hayden is caring, funny, and hardworking little dude with a big arm. In the classroom, he shows leadership by being aware of what is going on with his friends and being ready to help and share his positive perspective and personality. Hayden preserves during our Spanish week, perseveres, sorry, during our Spanish week by listening very carefully, taking time to process the information and self-talks to make sure he understood. It is outstanding to be able to trust Hayden by always making right choices in and out of the classroom. We are never worried about Hayden not being a part of our class community and inclusive to everyone. We are so proud of you, and we know you are going to reach for the stars. Love your teachers, Miss Barrett and Mrs. Moran.
Okay.
That was a good one. Good.
Audrey, do you want to go?
Sure.
You've got your glasses on and everything.
No, so I have Parker Sims, who I know and I've coached baseball with for a long time.
Look
and,
at that outfit.
Your cousin. So, and it looks like you can grow into it a little bit. Okay, so this is way too short, but I'll read it. I can always trust that Parker is doing what he needs to do during class. He's consistently on task and is self-motivated to do his best. Classmates like to work with Parker because they trust him to be kind and work hard. Parker's a person whose peers and teachers can trust and respect as a BMS student. Parker is also always on time, pays attention, listens to directions, is polite, works hard, and he's a cracking, naturally talented second baseman.
Follow that, Bill.
Yeah, I was going to say, impossible.
Do you want to
But
go?
I would be glad to, because I am so thrilled to introduce Tamara Gonzalez. Congratulations, Tamara. Okay, so now we have to say all kinds of wonderful things about you, and you're gonna blush, okay? I need my glasses, unlike Auden. Tamara goes out of her way to make everyone feel included and safe at school, especially new students. Great job, that's important. She is reliable and can be trusted to be kind and work hard in the classroom and sports. She has become a strong leader at BMS. Congratulations, Tamara. Great job. And please wear that to school.
Counselor Schwer.
All right. Kendra?
Kendra is a wonderful student who exemplifies trustworthiness in so many ways. She is the first to follow directions and is a leader to the rest of the class. I can rely on Kendra to lead by example because she has a great work ethic. Her classmates are quick to follow her example because they know she is doing the right thing. Kendra is always ready and willing to help others in and out of the classroom, whether she is helping her classmates with a math problem or helping a friend to the nurse when they fall on the playground. I can trust Kendra to be compassionate and helpful. I always know that she will work hard, participate in class, and try her best. I am so proud of you, Kendra. Love, Miss Anderson.
My turn. Okay, I am lucky enough to get to award this to a friend of mine who is like part of the family. And I was reading this in advance a little bit, and they have got it nailed. So Tristan Pilardi, will you come up, please? So embarrassing. Basalt High School senior Tristan Pilardi is an authentic person who is not trying to be anything he's not. He is likable, humble, and easy to talk to. Did they say humble? Easy to talk to, often lightening the mood. He is kind and compassionate, helping others and putting himself in their shoes. I know he will always be there for others, always helping and acknowledging what others can contribute. I can always trust Tristan to show integrity and stand up for what's right. And that was written by Lauren Karp. Is that right? Okay, I think everybody got the gist that you get a pool pass, and the other thing you get is if you will step out into the hallway, there will be a photograph taken for some wonderful purpose, I'm not sure what. Okay, all right. So if you want to step out there, the fellow with the plaid shirt will get a photo of you, and we can go on to the other business. Actually, you know what? We do have one more award that would be great if people stayed for. So I will, this is kind of a long award, and so we will take turns reading it. This is a proclamation honoring community service, and it's to Rita Fulton, and she's in here somewhere. I just saw her. Just so people can recognize you, because they see you everywhere. That's great. Okay.
Well, it's good that you have come on over here, because they have the film on your head. Coming right in.
That's definitely a little bit of a squeeze through there. Yeah, how can we honor you properly? Okay. So, whereas the character of our town depends on the relationships of our citizens, families, friends, and neighbors.
Whereas strengthening those bonds lies in the heart of the people, individuals who participate to help create a living, thriving community. These citizens are unrecognized, unsung heroes of our town, and
whereas Rita Fulton has been the volunteer lead and the Western Slope chapter of the American Red Cross since 2005.
Woo!
Wow. Rita trains and leads a team of dedicated volunteers in the Valley who answer the call when an emergency arises. Rita participates on the Basalt Emergency Management Committee and the Pickton County Safety Council. Valerie McDonald, Pickton County Emergency Manager, states, Rita always participates in our training exercises, giving generously of her time and vast knowledge. We can count on Rita during emergencies. She makes sure that people are taken care of during their worst times. Rita is very compassionate and resourceful and always steps up.
Whereas this summer, Rita's vast abilities helped many friends during the Lake Christine fire. According to Basalt Snowmass Village Fire Chief Scott Thompson, Rita's calm, reassuring personality helped ease many evacuees' nerves. Her goal was to provide a safe place to rest and become nourished, and she accomplished her task by the hundreds. When the incident When the incidents get completed, Rita always has a viable solution. She is an exemplary volunteer, always having energy and enthusiasm when called upon, even in the middle of the night.
Whereas, the town has called upon Rita twice since this summer's fire. The first being the Roaring Fork Apartments, where 77 individuals lost their homes temporarily. Rita spent numerous hours caring for each individual that was directed to her care. The second involved 7 persons that were displaced by a fire in their home. Rita responded in the middle of the night, arrived to greet the emergency responders with a smile and assurances that all evacuees would have somewhere safe to sleep that evening.
Whereas the town of Basalt and the Roaring Fork Valley are grateful that Rita Fulton is a community member. Now, therefore, we're almost done with it. We, the Basalt Town Council, proclaim that the town of Basalt is a far, far better place due to the experience, kindness, and commitment that Rita Fulton brings to every task she encounters. Thank you.
Thank you. And by the way, she not only helps the victims, but she also helps the elected officials a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you. Can I just take one moment? to
Of
say
course,
that
please.
I'm absolutely in awe. Thank you all very much, and I hope everybody understands that I'm only one person, and that I do have a team of volunteers that do respond with me. It's not just me. Thank you.
Has to happen with that. Okay, now you are allowed to go into the hallway and get your pictures taken and miss out on the business. Thank you so much for engaging in your community, kids and parents like this. It's our favorite thing. Okay, while people are marching out, I would just like to thank Grassroots TV for being here and always recording our meetings. You can, if you're not watching live, you can find our meetings at grassrootstv.org. We'd like to thank our videographer this evening, Felipe Luisi. Is that right? Okay, the mayor's coffee is canceled tomorrow as the council is having a special meeting tomorrow morning. And I think we did all that. That's great. That was a huge group of wonderful people.
That's good.
Okay, our first item is the consent agenda. I'll just quickly say what's on the consent agenda for the people in the public. It's a letter of support to Eagle County for early childhood proposals. It's a resolution of the town accepting the bylaws and authorizing the execution of the IGA with Colorado CIRSA. And it's an organization resolution and agreement for credit card program, authorizing Christine Hamrick and Jenny Aragon as signatories on the town's UMB credit card, and authorizing submittal of a grant application to the Department of Local Affairs for Peace Officer Mental Health Support Grant Program. So if anybody doesn't have a question and would like to make a motion, I would welcome that.
Mayor, I move the town council approve the consent agenda items as presented.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you. Those little kids always make me cry. Okay, our next item is our call to the public, where folks are invited to come up to the microphone and make 3 minutes or less comment regarding items that are not on the agenda. So if there's anyone in the audience who would like to come up, please do now, at this time.
I am absolutely humbled by all the people that came before me, and those kids were adorable. My name is Jacqueline Cartier. I am running for Eagle County Commissioner. I am a resident of Basalt. I've raised my son here in the Roaring Fork Valley since he graduated in 2008 from Aspen High School. And I work very closely with the Roaring Fork School District, Bridges High School in particular. And I just wanted to say that this is our opportunity to really get appropriate representation for Basalt and for this entire Roaring Fork area in Eagle County. And I know that there's been some stress and some issues that have come up, and I think having somebody here, and I plan on opening an office here, I just think it's critical because we represent 20% of Eagle County, but yet nobody is there from this area. And I am very well connected to both valleys, which is really helpful because I raised my son here. When he graduated in 2008, I moved over to Vail, and I became a columnist for the Vail Daily. So I spent several years there before returning here. So having that connection to both sides, I think, is really essential in terms of understanding the needs from across the entire county. And I would be honored to earn your vote. If you want additional information on me, my website is cartierforcommissioner.com. On there are some details of some really, really exciting projects we're going to bring forth. And there's also about 50 or 60 newspaper columns. I've got all of the links on there from the Vail Daily. So I'm quite literally an open book if you wonder about how I think about any particular issue. But I do thank you, and I am honored to be a part of this community, and I intend to represent it very well. And thank you for the time.
Thanks, Jackie. Any other members of the public that want to make a comment? Yeah.
Hello, Chris Matera, Basalt Chamber of Commerce. I just wanted to remind everyone that on Thursday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., we are partnering with the Small Business Development Center to do a business continuity and resiliency workshop. So think of it as a wildfire assessment but for your business. It is for, not if, but when something happens to your business, whether it's dealing with a wildfire, or a slide, or the owner has a heart attack and now what? So this workshop is specific to help business members out with that planning to think ahead and get ready and prepared. It is $20 for the general public, and Basalt Chamber members are subsidized. It'll be $10, and that includes lunch. So any questions, go to the chamber website, or it'll be at the library.
And I just want to say too, Chris has been really busy getting grant funding for local projects, doing these kinds of events and local education to help support businesses. So thank you. I don't know that we see you enough to say thank you adequately.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
At least I can do it.
Can I mention one quick thing? We've got an event on Saturday.
Okay.
Do you want me to go there?
Yeah.
Okay. Just wanted to let everyone know that there's a free barbecue downtown Basalt on this coming Saturday between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions that anyone has. And there's free food. So please come. Thank you.
Where downtown?
It's going to be right across the street, right by where Heirlooms is.
Okay, got it.
My office is right upstairs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. Any other public comment? Okie dokie. Thanks, everybody. Mayor and council reports and comments? Anybody?
I just have a quick comment. I just wanted to thank Sarah and Susan for all the work they do on the childhood development workshop. I've gotten to sit on a lot of the meetings recently, and there's a lot of good work going on, and I really appreciate how much work they put in because they are at every meeting. I can't make every meeting, so thank you guys so much.
That's great.
Sarah's not here, but I'll tell her in person. Good job. Thank you.
Other council, yes. Audie.
Just wanted to recognize Ryan, Boyd, and Tim, and anyone else in Public Works who did the fire mitigation pickup. It was amazing. Ryan and I, we had our driveways full of stuff, and I spent a lot of hours on it, and the second I did, I started sweating like a pig, and it was hard work. And so the manual labor they did for the 25 or 30 houses is amazing. It was great.
Thank you for recognizing that. Anybody else? Good comments. Things I wasn't totally aware of, so I appreciate it, let alone the public being aware. Mr. Manager, Mr. Mahoney, do you have anything?
Sure. I think I have two quick things. The fire mitigation was going to be one, so that did turn out to be pretty successful for our first run at attempting that. So we'll explore doing a similar thing next year and see if we can get some more houses to participate. But I think that was a good first step. Secondly, just a reminder, you all have been asking about the steering committee that would be associated with finding a solution for the shooting range. So there is a meeting tentatively scheduled to choose that steering committee. Both the mayor and myself were invited to that, as well as CPW, and my understanding is that we would participate in making those choices. The idea is to find a balanced group that kind of represents all interests ultimately, and bring back recommendations on solutions. So the first step, obviously, is choosing that group, and then I think we'll learn a little bit more about the process after that's completed. So I can keep you guys apprised on that.
Gary, did you have a question? Oh, you had a look. You had a
Bill,
question, look.
maybe
I just looked at you.
Okay. Did you have a
I
question?
was just curious if you had nominees for each of the committee positions that's up for whatever appointment. Do we need more people to serve on the committees, or are we good to go?
Oh, for the not that committee, you're talking about other town
For
committees.
the CPW committee?
Oh, for the CPW.
Right.
So they have a big list right now.
Okay.
Anybody that was interested at those first two public meetings they had left a name, so all of those folks have been invited.
Oh, good.
And so I think it's a lot of people. So we'll see after the meeting how that goes and if there's enough folks there to get a good committee going, so.
Anybody else have a question for Ryan? Okay.
And one other clarification, I put this in my Friday report, but I thought it was important to mention here as well. We got a call early last week from somebody that was concerned about the fact that we were using inmate labor in our parks. And I just wanted to clarify for this council that that's a resource for us. We've used inmate labor for quite some time in Basalt, and they're used throughout the valley. Nonprofit organizations such as Habitat use them quite a bit to be able to accomplish their work. These are supervised folks, and they don't get to be on this work committee when they pose a risk to the public. And in fact, they are people that are nearing their time, the end of their time there. So I just want to reiterate so that it's clear to council that we have had great success with them. We get a lot accomplished in a day, a week's worth of work in a day for the cost of buying lunch. And so it's been a great program, but it came up, and there was some concern by this person that we didn't sort of cast a broad net of identifying these folks as inmates. And in my opinion on it, I have not done that because I don't think that calling out that these folks are in the area has been a need, or has been, we haven't received that feedback from other folks before. So anyways, I just wanted to let you guys know that it's been a great program, and I think that we continue to have good partnership with Rifle Correctional Facility on that.
I actually appreciate that you called that out, because ever since I've been on council, we have used, all throughout the valley, we have used inmate, is that what we call them? Volunteers?
Inmate, yeah.
or-
Labor.
So I'm just glad you said that, because I don't think there's been any problems in the 20 or so years I've been here. So anyway, okay, our council actions. Our first one is a public hearing and second reading of Ordinance 17, an ordinance of the Town Council amending Chapter 2, Article 9, Victims and Witnesses Assistance Law Enforcement Board, and Section 2-139.5, imposition of court costs, providing for the disbursement of funds received through said surcharge of the Basalt Municipal Code. Greg? Yes.
Dan Stevenson, the chair of the Bell Board. Thanks for having us tonight. This is the second reading and public comment on revisions of the Bell Board. On October 9th, we came before you, presented the revisions and additions to the ordinance. After that meeting, there's been no changes to what you saw on October 9th, so I really don't have anything additional to add.
Ann?
Nothing further.
Okay, this is a public hearing though, so I will open the public hearing at 6:28. Is there anybody that has any questions or comments regarding this? Hearing none, I will close the public hearing, go to council. Questions, comments?
Mayor, I move that town council approve ordinance number 18, series of 2018 on first reading and continue, is this a second reading?
This is second, yeah.
Okay, on second reading.
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great, thank you, great
Thank you,
work.
guys.
Thank you.
Gary and I have done great work on that.
It's those two. We show up every once in a while.
We do indeed. Okay, our next item is public hearing and second reading, or first reading of ordinance 18, an ordinance of the town granting special review and slope review approvals to Barbara and Pat McMahon for a ground-mounted solar array at 208 Ridge Road. Watkins.
Hello, Madam Mayor. Thank you all for having us tonight. I have with me Tyler Sweeney, who is a representative for Pat and Barb McMahon. They are applying through Tyler for approval of a special review for a minor utility facility, which would involve 46 solar panels. And to go along with this is a slope review. As you said before, it was at the location here is 208 Ridge Road, and the solar panels will be placed on location at this lot inside the platted building envelope. The parcel itself, not on the location where the panels will go, but the parcel contains some steep slopes and is in the Hillside Overlay District, which is why this slope review is involved here. Staff believes that the project is in compliance with all the adopted long-range plans that are in effect here, including the master plan, which has some policies encouraging renewable energy devices, the Eagle County Climate Change Action Plan, and the Basalt Addendum to it, which identify generation of electricity as one of the big carbon footprint, sources of carbon footprint in basalt. We also think it meets the code requirements, which are the definitional ones found in section 16-4, the R1 requirements, as well as the hillside and steep slope site planning standards. I thought we would talk briefly about the issue of glare, because our P&Z, when they recommended approving it, they did want to have some discussion over it. So I brought some graphics for you all to see. This picture is taken from the Midland Avenue Bridge, as you can see, and the P&Z did do a site visit to there. Because the site itself is a little bit difficult to get to, you have to kind of jump over a flower bed, then go down some rocks, and then you get to where the panels are. So we thought it might be more beneficial to bring them to a place where this would potentially be visible. So I don't know if you can read it, but there's an arrow pointing to the house, and the panels would be, when you're standing on the site, you can see where this is here, but the P&Z could not see the panels that Tyler and Sarah Nadolny were holding them into the air. So you can't see anything here, but that's the location. This here is a photo simulation. If you look kind of closely, you can see where the panels are rendered in. And as you can see, there is some trees that are blocking the view. This is just a regular photograph. There's no rendering here. But this is kind of the base of the driveway on Ridge Road itself, showing how there's not going to be a lot of visibility from most angles. Yeah, and so here we have the site plan with the aerial and the regular site plan. Let me know if you want to switch back into a view or something like that. But so as I said, the P&Z took a site visit to Midland Bridge, couldn't see very much evidence of any kind of significant visual impact. When we did a site visit, we identified 3 homes in which you could see these panels from. But I want to draw a distinction between being able to see the panels and between there definitely 100% of the time being glare that would affect these homes. Glare, and Tyler will fill in the gaps here, he knows more about this than I do, But glare is all about the path of the sun and the angle of the sun. And so we don't think that there would be very many visual impacts from glare, but we've included some conditions of approval in which, and if there is glare, that it be addressed, that there be a plan for it. So this is a public hearing. I would recommend that if you guys are all comfortable with the conditions of approval that we've recommended, that you would schedule a date for the second reading, and as well as take public comments and any comments that Tyler would want to add.
Well, I guess real quick to touch on the glare concern, we actually did a glare analysis with a software program for the neighbors directly adjacent to McMahon's property. It's the closest one to their house and where the solar panels would be the most visible, and they have they have an art collection they had some concerns about as far as UV. So we did using a software program, like I said, did a glare analysis on various aspects of where the panels might be visible from through the windows, and the results were that the impacts were extremely minimal. And it would, for just a very short time during the day, during a certain time of year when the sun's angle would cast some glare off of the panels. And it was deemed insignificant enough that it's not an issue. If it does become an issue, or if it's later determined by the homeowners that there's some mitigation that needs to occur, the McMahons were amenable to that idea, so.
Great. Is that all that you
Yeah,
have?
that's all I have, yeah.
Okay. This is public hearing, so we will open the public hearing at 6:35. Is there anyone in the public who would like to make a comment regarding this application? Would you like to come up and just state your name?
Hi, I'm Dick Jackson, and I live on that curve just below Ridge Road. And I don't really have a concern. We have panels in our garage. So if you guys, if it truly addressed the glare thing, I didn't really want to just not participate and just kind of hope for the best. So,
Sure.
because I think we are, somewhat in line with where.
Is your house, do you have a flat roof then? It's a little bit further down as you?
No.
Go back to the aerial.
Sorry,
Can you go back to the aerial?
Down here, yeah, this is our place here.
So, my only concern would be if there really was a true glare issue, but if you guys have done
Yeah.
your homework, so, yeah.
Well, from the angle that your house being south of the panels and the sun actually shining into the panels,
Yeah.
there wouldn't be an opportunity for a reflection back towards your house. So the concern with glare is typically when you're looking at it, kind of, if this is the array and the house is over here and the sun was coming up early morning and was reflecting directly off the panels into the house. But, if your house is down here, there's going to be zero opportunity for that.
Has there been any thought of placing the array above their home, still on their property, as opposed to where it's proposed? Or?
Well, I believe with the activity envelope, it would pose a lot of challenges. We
Yeah.
did look at that hillside that was kind of up in the grass there, and that was a lot steeper and more challenging.
I think there was an issue with the power lines as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Power
I
lines.
think that's true. You have to stay a certain lateral distance away from power lines.
Okay.
So let me ask this. Have you been able to hook up for a communication with either Pat or his representative?
No, that's why I came down, because.
Could you make that happen? Because I think a lot of this, maybe you could find out a little bit more and get more comfortable if you actually had conversation with these guys versus, I think that our staff has got us pretty well
Yeah.
satisfied with the information, but if more would come up,
Well, I know
think,
the terrain intimately. And
Yeah.
so.
and if you know Pat, he's a pretty
Oh, yeah, yeah.
amenable guy.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what I would suggest. Can't make you, but
Yeah, you're welcome to reach out to me directly at Sunset Solar if you want to.
that would be
Yeah,
really
okay,
good.
Some more
that's-
questions?
You guys, we got ours
Could
from
you
you
shoot
as
him
well.
a phone number? Could you give him?
No, that's easy.
Oh, okay,
That's
all right.
That's who you worked
them
with?
before.
At one point? Okay.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
comments.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Sure.
right. Anybody else? Okay, hearing none, we'll close the public hearing. Go to council for comments or questions regarding the application. Bill?
2 comments. Great job. Really enthusiastic that Pat and Barb are going to be able to hook up to solar. Very disappointed that Holy Cross would not permit others in the neighborhood to also hook up to this. You cannot have a multi-house hookup, which is truly unfortunate because we were talking about having the whole HOA go off-grid. And so if there is a way to influence or encourage Holy Cross to consider this in the future, that would be wonderful, because we as town council are going to be very focused on climate action coming forward, and to the extent that we can help households move out of the grid onto whatever solar, that would be great. The only other comment is for a project of this size, which is significant but still small, I marvel that you had to prepare 30 pages of documentation and maps and other stuff. This, quite frankly, strikes me as kind of business regulatory burden that is excessive. So I would hope that we could look at this also in the context of our efforts to make it easier for business to do business in our town.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a quick comment. Thank you, Barbara and Pat, for doing this. It's a huge array, significant amount of solar. It's difficult and expensive. It has payback, but it's great of them to do this. And my only other comment is we should love these and perceive them as beautiful. And when your neighbor puts them in, you should be thanking them, not trying to see if there's an issue. Like, if it glares a little bit in my house, I'll welcome it.
Good point.
Here, here.
Thank you very much for all that information. So, if there's no more questions. Yes, what?
Am I allowed to know how many kilowatts that's making?
How many kilowatts? I think it is just over 15, if I'm not mistaken. 345 watt panels, 46.
That's,
Quick math,
I was just
yeah.
wondering the ballpark.
Yeah, I think it's 15.
It's about 110% of their house's historic use.
Yep.
Wow.
And we had to do this review because it's not on their roof, correct? Because when I got panels, I didn't remember having to
It's
go through.
the ground mounted and also kind of the scale of it with 46 panels.
Yeah, to your point, when we put it on a roof, it was like, put it on my roof.
Yeah, there was no.
Gonna be here Tuesday, right?
Yeah, you have to have an inspection.
Because we had tried to get everybody on, and it
Yeah.
just,
Yeah,
there were a
well,
couple
that was a
impediments,
Holy
which were
Cross
really
hiccup. Yeah.
unfortunate. But
Mhm.
great job, you guys, too. I mean, if I had enough roof space, I'd have them on my roof, too.
Yeah.
Is that a motion?
Close enough.
Second.
Yep.
Further discussion?
And just to clarify that the motion was to approve ordinance 18, series of 2018 on first reading, continue and set the public hearing and second reading for November 13th.
Thank you.
There you go.
So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Keep
you.
up the great work.
Yeah, great job.
Yeah.
Good.
Did you work with SunSense too? All right, we got a lot of SunSense folks.
Okay, we are taking a 5-minute break.
Well, it's more than probably 5 minutes.
More than 5, we're taking a break.
It's all, I mean.
Okay, this is a continued public hearing on Basalt River Park. And I just want to say that even though we are continuing the public hearing, we have taken public comment at previous meetings. We will take public comment in future meetings. This particular meeting, we are going to focus on a conversation amongst the parties, the applicant, the staff, and the elected officials. So hopefully people are tuned in and will be able to bring their comments back to the next meeting. So this is Basalt River Park LLC, on behalf of the Roaring Fork Community Development Corporation, a Colorado nonprofit, has made an application to develop 28 residential units, 3 commercial buildings, which are proposed to include 2 nonprofit facilities and a food and beverage operation, and associated improvements on the property and on town-owned property adjacent to or near property, commonly known as the CDC property. Development actions include rezoning to the community serving commercial zone district, CSC sketch plan review, amendments to the CSC zone district, sketch plan subdivision, ESA, and ESA reach to floodplain review. Please, no. Okay, I already said that. All right, so, Brian, are you?
Turning it over to me.
I'm
Yes,
turning.
I'm ready.
Turning.
That's right. So, okay, so thank you for accommodating our rearrangement of furniture. The intent was that we would be able to kind of have a more intimate discussion, still involving the public. But we've got some visuals for you tonight that we wanted to make sure that all of council would be able to see, and there might be a little better interaction among council and the applicant. And so tonight, the goal is to respond to some of the comments that we heard from council at the September 26th, September 25th public hearing. And we're going to address 4 main topics tonight. So the first is to talk a little bit about the background, how we got here and what offers context to this application. Secondly, we're going to talk a little bit about the process, and I'm going to have Mr. Conklin, our attorney, just sort of address that for you all, because there was a request to look at the process and see if we had some flexibility within that. And then we're going to talk about some new ideas that have emerged since the last meeting that we all had, the last public hearing. And then finally, we're going to finish the conversation with what we call the bookends. And that really is some specific questions that we want to direct towards council and have a bit of an interactive conversation both between you all and the applicant, but really getting feedback from you all so that Tim would be able to continue to revise his application, and that's the intent. So I'll start off with a little bit of the background. So back in 2013, the town kicked off our town planning process. And the scope of that study included this property we're in today, Lions Park, Basalt Center Circle, and what was then the Pannet Fork Mobile Home Park. And the intent of that study was really to find an appropriate balance between the riverfront park and commercial uses along the Roaring Fork River. And it also included ways to strengthen the physical and visual connections between town and the river corridor. So I think at that time, there was a desire to really draw strength from the river and identity for the town. And so that's expressed ultimately in that plan that we adopted and has been part of the conversation so far. That planning process, just for reference, included comments from over 600 residents. It included school children, business owners, and over 1,000 drawings and written comments that were then distilled down into a report ultimately. And that report was written by the DAC committee. So that was the Downtown Area Advisory Committee. And they were a balanced group of representatives, was the idea, that were able to take a lot of those ideas, as you can tell from my description, thousands of ideas, and try to distill them into a plan. And so ultimately a recommendation came from that, and it provided development goals and guidelines for achieving those goals in that plan. And the town adopted the plan ultimately as part of the master plan revision in 2015. So that was both the Planning Commission and the Town Council. And so staff has used that document as guidance for the initial response to the application. So with that, that's just kind of a very broad background on how we got to where we are today. And then I'm going to have Jeff talk a little bit to you about the process.
Sure. Some of this will be a little redundant, but nevertheless, excuse me, at the first two meetings, as you know, there was the initial presentation of the application by the applicant. We took initial public comment from the public, got initial feedback from council on that application, and then also kind of heard, help us with a more productive way to review this application. And this is what we've come up with. Because this is an active land use application, we are in a quasi-judicial setting. This is a public hearing. This is noticed, it's open to the public. All the documents that might be put in front of council are going to become part of the public record. The purpose, though, is to have a staff-led discussion through the more detailed parts of the application to allow for a little bit more back and forth on the sketch plan. I want to see more of this, I want to see less of that, I like this, I don't like that, what's acceptable, what's not. Again, this is, that's the type of discussion we're trying to facilitate, and that would then, at a future public hearing, allow for an opportunity for public comment, additional public comment on this application. And so following this, there'll be something more for the public to comment on. And with that, also in mind, the idea with this type of setting was to set aside a couple of hours in a row to really allow to get into the issues. If the applicant and council want to set a public hearing at a special meeting date to allow, you know, more time, we can do that as well. But this is the first start, and I'll turn it back to Ryan.
Okay, good. So as I said, we've been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of talking at the staff level. Did a number of hours of brainstorming about the application. We engaged Tim after those. We got excited about some new ideas, and we wanted to get his first reaction to that, and he joined the conversation, and I think we had some really productive dialogue about it. And I wanted to introduce that to this council a little bit tonight, and it's a bit of a modification on the original application, and I'll kind of walk you through what that looks like, but then that'll lead into the questions that we're going to get to next. So as we begin talking about it, we you know, heard what you said at the last meeting about anchor uses and vibrancy in the park. That's been a big conversation over my time here with the town. And you know, the applicant, Tim, has introduced some different uses in here, residential uses, nonprofit uses, and we picked up that there was something lacking in that there was something more needed. And one of those things was that vibrancy piece. There was an offering of a small food and beverage type of use in there. It was about 1,000 square feet. And that seemed inadequate for what the council's discussions had been about it, what discussions with the public had been about it. And so we wanted to think of ways to expand that. And so we actually picked up on an old idea and began to play with it. And so I bring you back to a design that was presented by Harry Teague at one point in time, but it was a community serving building that was over towards the eastern part of the development, still outside of the big V, but it was one that included food and beverage in it. It had 3 different restaurants, and they were small, sort of quick eateries that interacted with the park setting that we're trying to create. And I think that we can pick up from that, but then maybe add to that concept a little bit. The vibrancy with bringing food into the equation, but then also a place for people to come and enjoy a beer, a glass of wine, something along those lines, and having it be in a way, an incubator, a concept sort of opportunity for people looking to try out something new. And so if we were able to get that level of entry, in other words, the rents to a certain level in here, by nature of their size, I think we might be able to get some new and innovative ideas in the food and beverage world, as well as in the beer and wine and things along those lines. So that would be a ground floor. And what we envisioned was a building that was designed such that it could open up and be sort of part and parcel to a park setting that would flow back and forth very easily in the warmer months, and then it would be conditioned space, and you could close it down in the winter months and still have a nice place for people to come. And the idea too on the park was to still have activities in the winter time, and so that there would be a reason for people to be there and be out onto the park area. The second part of that was actually a second story that we were talking about, and this would be a community space, one that was open to the public. We thought of it as a place where you could have a wedding, you could have public meetings. We also thought of this space as one that we could actually move the town council meetings, planning commission meetings, all of these town meetings that we regularly have in this room over to a new site that is state-of-the-art, has a more comfortable setting, more room, and would be
wireless microphones.
Wireless microphones, yes. But what that does for us in this building, actually, is create additional space that we're in need of. So as right now, we have every single office in this space taken up, as well as the building next door. And there will come a time that we'll need additional office space. That gives us flexibility in this room and in the town hall generally for an easy remodel to be able to create that. Also over there, we've been talking a lot with the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce is doing a great job of looking at ways to enhance our local economy. I just recently attended a meeting where we got a grant, and Chris Matera got a grant, and put on a workshop to talk about a co-working space. And that co-working space, we got some really good feedback on that as far as location, how well it might work in a rural setting like Basalt. We have a lot of transient traffic from people traveling, coming and visiting in the summer for second homes and things, that they need a place to work. And so we think that if we think through all of these ideas on the building, it can't be everything to everyone, but a lot of these ideas that are emerging that we're talking about in the community could end up finding their way or finding a home over here across the street. And we think that the building itself could be a really great example of how to build for community and how to make it interact with both the area contextually, but then also the park. We keep talking about the park and the activities that are over there, and we want that to be a big part of this. And so I think the discussion tonight, I left out one detail. Ultimately, we also began to talk about, who owns and who manages something like this? And at least what we would present tonight is that this could be a town-owned asset. It could be something that we manage. It would require probably an additional employee to do the bookings and manage the leases and things of that nature. But there is precedent for that. There's precedent in this valley. Aspen does something similar with the Wheeler Opera House and the restaurant offering they have there. I've had experience with this over in Buena Vista in a public-private partnership that we had with the developer of South Main, and the entire river corridor and the improvements that were done in there were done through grants in part and matching funds from the developer. The developer wrote the grant on our behalf. The town administered it and administered the construction. And here we are 15 years later, and that is intact and working well. And so I think there are good things to look toward and examples for us so that we're not necessarily reinventing the wheel on how this would work structurally. And so with that, I think that kind of drives this community piece for at least staff, and I think that we've had some interest from Tim as well. But with that is trying to find how we balance the rest of the development. And we know we've had a discussion about the residential, how much residential works on this site. And I think that there's a bit of a trade-off in if we want some contribution for investment into a building like this, that is driven by the amount of residential. But I don't think we necessarily need to be held to a certain level. I think we still need to have that discussion on what's the appropriate amount of residential to be able to really complement what the other uses are. And we are also still talking about the art base as a very viable project on here, and I think that also would complement some of what we've been talking about with this building. So, so with that, I think we're going to go into the questions. And the idea here, once again, these are the bookends. We really want to get some of the feedback from you, and we may ask for some interaction from the applicant on this, but we want it to be as open a dialogue as you feel comfortable with, just so that we can really start to drill down on what works for you and what doesn't with the proposal. So, so with that, can I steal your list of questions?
Yes, please.
Or borrow them?
Brian, before you start.
Sure.
What's the nature of the art base situation? When we discussed it, do they buy the land? Do they get the land? Where was that conversation?
Well, I think, so we have had a conversation with the art base, just loosely, and we did talk about the possibility of them purchasing the land. Mm-hmm. And I think that conversation, a lot of it surrounded the residential component. And the residential component, once again, was going to help to provide that subsidy for the land. And so, at least in an initial conversation, we obviously didn't talk price, but there was a willingness to look at that.
Which is a change from the underlying application.
That's right.
Dirt.
Right.
Yep.
And that would be east of where would it be?
So the community building,
East of the community building?
it would be west of the community
West of
building.
it, toward Armine.
Toward RMI, that's right. So the community building would really be the anchor on the west end, and I think that's an important location for it in the sense that, I'm sorry, on the east end.
Upstream.
Yes.
Upstream.
Upstream, yes.
Yeah, give
Because
me
we wanted to
upstream.
integrate ultimately with the larger park area.
Right.
Other questions?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want to,
I'll go right into the questions. So, so the first one, the first topic is about vibrancy. Vibrancy was something that seems to be repeated to me as far as really wanting to have this project overall activate that parcel. And so the first question deals with the combination of the proposed anchor uses. And these aren't the part that I just described to you, but they are the art base and the Chamber of Commerce, which were presented in the application as the anchor uses. And do they have potential to produce the desired vibrancy? And so you guys commented on that a little bit, but we want to get some more feedback on it just so that we can offer direction ultimately to Tim.
could we just have a brief discussion or your thought about what is vibrancy? Because I think it's like dirty books. It's like,
sure.
it's different to different people.
I think vibrancy, from what I've understood, is basically a project that attracts people. I think people are the root of vibrancy, and something that would bring not just one demographic, but you get young and old and everywhere in between, that there's something for them there. And I guess that would be the most simple explanation.
I mean,
Second.
that's kind of how I see it. Is there other thoughts about what vibrancy is if it's not that? Okay, that's kind of what I think, so
Okay.
it seems like people agree. All right.
So we want to talk about those initial anchor uses that were presented. So we had the art base and the Chamber of Commerce as sort of being the focus, and wanted a little bit of feedback on that from you all.
Auden, you want to go?
Sure. One of my comments to you, Ryan, was, I don't know that this design that you guys came up with is the optimal design. It's cool, I like it. I would support bringing in other design thinkers to just weigh in partially on our dime. My gut is that if something like this food court community building works, it is going to provide a level of park-facing vibrancy that we haven't discussed or kind of solved before. There's a reason to be there. There's a bar in this, right? Mm-hmm. So it faces the park, it opens to the park. You've kept the nonprofit campus over there, but it has its own, vibrancy in terms of getting people through there. And then you're having, some cause for people to be there and activate the park. Depending on how we use the upstairs, if it's modular, that could further benefit. If it's modular, meaning during the day there's some workspace or whatever, I don't know. So generally it seems good to me. I don't know if it's the right thing. I'd love to run it by some people or a person or whatever. The other point, though, I think is really important is we're going to have to come to a conversation about what level of residential or housing is on the other side. And there's two aspects to that. One is, how does the project become financially viable for you? And for me, the other piece is replacement housing. And I would love for council to consider the idea of more dense, potentially deed-restricted units on that far western side. And Susan, I think there's a plan in the archives of that. There's a drawing of dense, 1 to 2 story or 1.5 story housing. Am I hallucinating?
Well, I think you're gonna see some ideas later on today that maybe incorporate some of those ideas.
Okay, I just wanted to call that up if it exists, but my point is, in our past conversations, we've said, we don't want a lot of density, and by the way, the other thing I've said is, how am I gonna compromise? How is every one of us gonna compromise? Well, I think there should be a lot of density on that west side, and I think there should be a decent amount of smaller, affordable housing. That's what activates the park. That's what keeps this coffee shop from going out of business. If you don't have people, you don't have vibrancy. And so, and by the way, we need housing, and by the way, we eliminated all this housing on this thing. We're not gonna replace it all. Let's try to do our best within our constraints to put some of it back. And if it can be done in a way that makes money, that adds to the pro forma on this thing. So west side, more dense housing, and then there'll be a conversation around what kind of residential condos or townhomes do you need to make the whole thing work. And I think a piece of that vibrancy comes from the housing.
Okay, so I'm just going to circle back for the next people who will weigh in. I think what Ryan is wanting us to answer on this first round is, does the existing application produce the kind of vibrancy that we're talking about, that we're thinking that we are wanting?
It's those existing anchor uses or the proposed anchor uses.
Here. Are you prepared to speak?
Sure, I can speak. Oh, Ryan, want to talk?
No, you can go.
When I said at the first meeting was that, to me, you know, I kind of, I didn't necessarily have an issue with the art base being an anchor tenant, but I needed more. I needed more commercial uses to be community serving, because the way I was looking at it was, they're just one of potentially more nonprofits that really need a landing zone, because we have two right next door that are already built. You can create this nonprofit campus, small. I mean, it's like, I'm not looking for 40 more different nonprofits to come in here, but that's why I originally wasn't that up against the art base being, you know, kind of the anchor tenant, but I would base it more on a nonprofit campus being an anchor tenant. And so adding the community building to this and reducing the housing, you know, my compromise is for me, allowing any housing on this. Because originally, I didn't want any housing on this parcel whatsoever. The public never said they wanted any housing on this. There's a park, I really worry about putting housing and dense housing, because then if you do park things, are they gonna start complaining about noise and vibrancy? So then you have this compromise between the two. So I'm a little worried about dense housing unless we figure out a way to make sure that it doesn't compromise the potential uses of this community center. You're talking about weddings, you're talking about events, and then you put a ton of housing, they're not gonna like the events. And so I worry about that. I think you know, to me, replacement housing sounds a lot better than free market, but, you know, could I live in a world of compromise? Maybe. I'd love to see how this would sketch out. I mean, to me, you know, I believe in vibrancy is not about necessarily people living on this parcel, but people using this parcel. So that's why the nonprofit center, that community center, you know, with a little housing could make that work for me. So, you know, I'd really, and I'm not against you guys doing sketch plans with us, figuring out a way to make it happen, but trying to find a way to, what does this community building look like? What is, you know, going back to the DAC and going back to, you know, the principles of that DAC was connecting the town to the river. How do you keep the connection to the river, and you know, provide the there. And the only way that I see there, housing wasn't there. It was activity, commercial activity, and it wasn't just tons of restaurants and all that stuff, but nonprofits or even offices and people being on this parcel during the day, you know, provides some vibrancy, because I believe the park will provide vibrancy, and this community building idea sounds okay to me, but I'm definitely open to keeping the conversation going.
Ron?
At the first look on the, the proposal with the anchor tenant of just the coffee shop and art base, it's a good start, but I think we do need more. I think one proprietor of coffee or beer is not what everyone was looking for in the vibrancy and the use. And I also would maybe look to even more mixed use as the valley is growing. We need more commercial areas for offices and people to conduct their business. And so I wonder if there's even a more mixed-use proposal that we could address some of it. And I think Auden's idea of more replacement housing is great, but you know, how much can you balance all of that in one area? I guess is my question. So.
And what do you think about the specifically the anchor uses? You kind of commented that there would be maybe more, and your idea of an anchor use is maybe more aligned with something that's going to create more activity,
yeah,
like the restaurants.
I think the community center is a great idea. With, you know, creates a different style. It's more than just one. I think one anchor tenant on that park is probably not enough.
Thanks, Ron. Anybody?
I'm happy to listen for another round.
Okay.
I agree with in terms of compromise, I share the same concern that Gary expressed, I never really envisioned significant housing on this parcel. And it's actually, for me, moving a critical component of our community and our workforce away from this parcel into housing that's being proposed that they could never obtain and afford really concerns me. But back to anchor uses, when I look at this project, what I see is housing, and on the end of it, what we have now here in Lions Park. We're moving the caboose over there, and we're moving the art base over there. There needs to be more of like what Ryan was describing, because as is, I don't think it will not generate the vibrancy that I expect.
Katie, can I ask a clarifying question? And Ryan, it sounded like you and Katie, are talking about the original proposal, but I think what we're talking about here is a modified new proposal that would have less housing, less free market condo housing, maybe more smaller affordable housing, and would do what you're describing, which is, so it's, the compromise is less housing, more community serving stuff. So that would get pushed over and back, and this new building would change. But it just seems like you're responding to the previous.
Well, I
think
don't
that's
know
what-
of any other application that I'm looking at other than what's been provided in the packet, which is what we've been talking about for months.
Can you clarify
And-
that?
And that's, I think, Katie, you're correct. That initial question we were wanting to get at is really, we do have an application in front of us, and so we want to look at it through that lens initially and provide that feedback. So these
Didn't
anchor
we do
uses.
that at the last meeting?
We didn't get real clear direction, and I
Actually,
think
Katie
that's
wasn't
what
here.
we're.
I wasn't here.
So
Yeah,
it's good to
Katie
hear
wasn't
that.
here. So we're trying to get that out. And then I think that part of this discussion, though, has been designed so that we can also talk about emerging ideas.
Got it.
And so it, but we do want to get some of that initial feedback on the application.
And Ryan, if I can just follow up on that, there has been that initial public comment, and as you're going through right now, it's, we have these 4 components or more of this application. Do we push them up, down? How do we change the levels of those? So as Ryan started to get into it, it's, all right, we're looking at the anchor tenant. Do we need to push, enhance that this way or crank it down another way? How do we want to see more of or less of, or what's acceptable or what's not? So this first bullet point on the discussion, I think, is kind of geared towards that use. And then the residential piece, that's another bullet point for discussion coming up that hopefully we'll be able to get into.
Okay, just to recap for anybody who's listening, that first question is, does the combination of the proposed anchor uses produce or have potential to produce the desired vibrancy? And I think many of us did comment at the first meeting that we thought it fell short of producing the kind of vibrancy that we envisioned. And I remember when the newbie came onto council, that would be you're one of the newbies, and had a vision of how the vibrancy would look that was very similar to mine, which is that there is a combination of attractions for our community to come to this park where adults and children and older people and any kind of person can gather, and families could watch their children ice skating in the winter from these. I always envisioned a restaurant of some kind. And so that's more what, it's been pretty consistent. That's what I have always envisioned, and I think that staff has done a ton of work to evolve that to more than just a restaurant, which I think is great. And I was another one who ranted about having housing on this parcel. However, I think we're gonna have to talk about housing because otherwise, this is basically a public development completely. If we don't allow housing, it is a public development, which, I'm not saying that's off the table either if it comes to that, but I think we would like to get this to work so that it didn't have to be an all-public development. Phil, do you have anything on this one? Okay. So can we?
Okay, we'll move on. Yeah, no, I think that gave us some pretty good insight. So the second one, I'll actually stand up for this, because you have some maps over here behind you. And what this really, this question is geared to address is, where on the park is there a development line? We've had different iterations of that over time. That came partially out of the DAC process. I gotta swivel this way. I can't wait for that wireless mic. So this first one here was a map that was that came out of the Our Town planning process, and you can actually see the property up here, and it's split approximately in half. And so half was to be park, half was to be some development, and there was another little node just right over here, which was, as I understand, I believe it was like a pedestrian entrance, a patio, some kind of area like that. After that process, we came down to this second map here, which was ultimately the one that was adopted in the master plan. And so that map was actually intentionally left without scale, and it talks about that in there. So there were bubbles. It was more general in its area of use. But you can still see in here that they're contemplated some area of mixed use and some area of park, approximately in the same configuration that we have up there. But the master plan also points us to taking into account not just that map as we're talking about the development, but also the other goals and the principles, and they actually used the word essence of the master plan, and I think that's really how master plan is to be used. It's not just hinged on one focus. And so that was the map that we have officially adopted. And then with Tim's initial application, you can see here that for reference here is the Midland Spur that comes down, and it's over here. So part of the development, about that much of it, would go over onto what was not the Big V area, but was over that original line. And so this question really gets at, as we introduce some of these new concepts to you, how steadfast are you all with regard to needing to adhere to that line, particularly in the context of there being a town-owned use on it, and one that is specifically designed to integrate with the rest of the park. And so that's one question for you to banter about. And then the other question on that would be, in its current configuration, where there was more of a nonprofit that was non-town owned and didn't quite have the same interaction with the park, and kind of what were your general feelings on that? So
Could you ask that again?
yeah, I'll come over here. So we're really, just to bring it down to the basics, what we're looking for is, we've got a master plan. That master plan shows a general area that's contemplated for development. And the project, as you can see up there, steps over that line if you look at that map. And so if there is to be, it's sort of two-part, if there is to be development that's publicly owned, where does that line fit for you guys? Is it as important versus it being privately owned as in the current application?
Well, I'll go first because I have spent way too many years thinking about this. I feel pretty strongly that the community expects us to hold the line on that half part. So, this doesn't meet that to me at all. And I also feel that, I think Auden was mentioning that if there is gonna be housing, which I know that's on the other side, and we can't look at that right now, but if there is gonna be housing, then it needs to go, is that west?
Yes.
It needs to go farther west, allowing, for our public idea, should it occur, to either be behind that 50% line or potentially move to the bridge to leave that clear span open as we have envisioned for several years now. So I feel pretty strongly about that line, and I think that we just need to maybe move on to some of the other questions before we can come up with where does it go. But I think if we don't end up with a 7,000 square foot art base, if that moves back into the picture a little bit and the town, the public option becomes the main draw, I think it looks completely different than this, so.
Others?
I suppose this is where,
Actually,
No,
Auden had his hand up.
Artie's spoken, so-
Just ask for
sorry, thought I got the nod.
Go for it.
I guess this is where I'm coming into this as we are new council people. There have clearly been a lot of assumptions that have been made, and then we're currently faced with this notion of, you haven't been on council, the decision's been made. But the way I kind of look at this, the surveys that were done after the Our Town process didn't conclude definitively in one way or the other what should be there. A majority of the people said they didn't want a park. 39% said they did. A majority of the people said, or the largest majority said they wanted restaurants. And I guess this is all to say, it seems to me that we've come very far down the pike and people have reinterpreted and interpreted what they perceive the Our Town process and the DAC to have said, when in fact none of that is ironclad. As I understand too, even the amendment of the master plan with this ostensible big V. Master plans are guidance. That was in our packet that we received today. These are not binding. So stepping back from this, I look at the CDC and you, the preferred developer now, as the interested parties who have an option on 2-point-something acres. And I look at this and say, well, if we want connections to the river, there's nothing in any of this documentation that says it has to be all on one side. So from an urban planning perspective, why would you not consider other connections? If we want to preserve significant visual access, tell me what significant is and I'll tell you if it's enough or not in my book, but it might be different in someone else's. So in short, the notion of debating about how many or how big the apartment should be, or whether the art base or whether a publicly owned facility are the right elements, kind of misses the point, in my opinion. We should be directing you in the manner according to whatever the zone is and according to these broad precepts. And then I think get back to you and evaluate whether or not what you've done hits the mark. But it begins with this bigger issue of why you're only developing half of what you would otherwise be able to develop. Because if you've been told that you can't develop it, then that has a lot of different implications, I would think. And so I think we are at a point where there are a lot of other issues that have been now placed on the table. In the original DAC and in the original Our Town survey, they talked not about the CDC parcel in isolation. They talked about it in conjunction with Lions Park, and you could also argue Basalt Circle, Center Circle. And so I think trying to fit a bunch of little pieces onto a fraction of a parcel that you as a private landowner have a right to develop just kind of seems misguided to me. I don't get that. I don't see the logic of that.
So Bill, could you go a little step further and say, what would you like to see?
Well, I think Auden proposed it at a meeting or two back. And again, I realize the town has been traumatized through these variety of processes that have gone not too far. But Auden had suggested, and I would certainly second the notion of bringing in an external consultant, which, by the way, is also what P&Z concluded at their meeting last week, and said, we would like to have a world-class, world-renowned, not from our town, urban planner, designer, to come in and help us evaluate the land that we have currently available to us and the configuration of assets that we would want to have on this parcel. Because even with this new possibility for a food court with what sound like kind of a big hall on top, you know, I don't think that's going to get us to what we want to do either. And so if it represents the best thinking, I remain to be persuaded, frankly. So I'm sorry to set this back in a very different space. And if it comes to be, as I expect it may, that I am voted down 6-1, so be it. But I will defend the rights of the private sector to develop their land in a manner that is consistent with the existing law, regulation, and zoning code. And that is where I shake out on this, which is a very different position, I know.
And you are aware that they are asking to be outside of the CSC zoning in a number of places?
In a number of regards, on the residential, yeah, I realize that, but, you know, again, if I were, I won't speculate, but I am still, from the perspective of the town councilor, entertained that we are not developing the whole parcel. I don't think that there's anything that says developing the parcel would restrict or preclude citizen access to the river. You've got 2 acres spread across the riverfront. That's an awful lot of access already. I don't think that we've contemplated the integration of Lions Park at all. And so you've got a number of moving parts. If we restrict our view to only a very limited number of options, that seems unwise to me. I just don't think that's a really good idea.
So, I don't disagree with the idea that there's a good, fun, cool, smart design that could happen if we went back to the drawing board. But I think the value of this meeting might be that we could get a sense of the council and a sense of the developer's viewpoint on what we want to do. I mean, is there the appetite on council to go back to the drawing board? Is there an appetite from your end, Tim, to get a designer and start more or less from scratch, and then bring that into the community and have everyone say, oh, I like this, I don't like this. I think what Ryan's trying to do is say, we got so far down the road, council seems to think that the park ought to be here, the developer is amenable to selling that piece to the town, and we go forward. So it's sort of a good, this is an opportunity for us to say, well, do we want to do that bigger thing, go back to the drawing board, or does council feel that this is an appropriate direction and we massage it, given the parameters that Ryan has provided? And Ryan's vision, I think, is that we're trying to listen to the community over several years. So that's the deal. And I'm asking council, what do you think? Because this is sort of the crux issue.
So let's get other people to weigh in on that, and I think that question really is something like, do we want to go with basically what has been run up the flagpole and approved more than once over the last 5 years on the way this parcel is basically going to be split up for development versus park, or something else?
Well, if we go down that road, we are putting this on hold for years, and I imagine you will be gone, and the conversation is a waste of everyone's time, because the community, in my view, has established that the V is the community's parcel, and that's like a given after years and years of conversation. And we have a proposal that's respecting that and honoring that and allowing that. So having an outside consultant come in and help us massage what's here, I think is an option that I would consider. But blowing up everything that the community has invested in over years and years and years, I don't think that that's going to be fruitful or prudent for this council.
Thanks, Katie. Gary?
I think I've been pretty clear on what I originally said, that I'm open to a design. I mean, I've been playing with your design while we've been doing it. Well, because the whole thing to me was, you know, the visual connection, preserve significant visual and visual access to the river. And that's why the big V was created. And yes, is it set in stone exactly what it's going to look like? No. I mean, that is still being able to be played with. But connecting that and the way it was done through the community and the way, I mean, I've been sitting on council for a while now, and the way that we've been working between the community on it is really trying to provide that large connection to town without development sitting in the way and being able to do that. Now, how that lines up, you know, I'd love somebody to show me something really cool and different. These guys have been the first to really try to start that conversation on it. I feel that, you know, I still, looking at the amount of residential on this, it's hard to see how you can align this community connection to your rivers and to your parks with a potential community center and you know, kind of what the anchor pieces will be. And so, you know, I'm still open to this discussion because obviously Tim is sitting here. He's representing a development, you know, team that's still listening. And so I'd like to give them due process on this. And I think I give them a lot of credit for listening to us on this, because I think he's heard pretty clearly that we are not happy with this design, that, you know, it's pretty universal that this iteration is not going to work. But I'm hoping that we're giving them some clear direction and showing that some of us are willing to compromise on values that we never thought possible. I thought when we moved the people off of this, we wouldn't put people back on it to live. And, you know, and if ever there was going to be people back on it, it was going to be kind of replacement affordable housing. But, you know, to get all these other community benefits and to get a really large visual connection and physical connection to town for this, you know, I'm willing to look at options.
Ryan?
I guess one of my biggest questions is that on the V, you can look between these two, and you can see on the bottom one, we have the V, and the open plaza is still way to the west of it. And so I understand, you know, and like Bill said, the way DAC is written, you can interpret it in a couple ways. And I personally don't think we need a full acre. And I think you can look in that visualization, that isn't a full acre, that's probably a half acre. And you still have the exact V you want, and it gives us more room to fit more in that area. And so I just wonder where we came up where it had to be an acre, and how that's set in stone when it's how you read it. And so is the acre the demand, or is it a flexible measure of park to get to that exact V? Because if you look at the top one, the V is actually a little bigger than the bottom. And so I just wonder on scale where that exact V comes in and how much of the park actually needs to be, you know. I think you should literally go draw a line on their property and you could see the way the V is and measure it to get the actual visualization of what we're looking for.
Yeah, you know, to agree with Ryan and push back on you a little bit, Jackie, you know, I think if there were, well, first, everyone's gonna have to compromise in a painful way on this, myself included, if we're gonna get it done. But if there were this cool community serving building that was on the edge of this parcel that you say is inviolate, and it spilled out patios or doors or whatever spilled out onto the park and encroached on this, I'd say that's exactly what we want. So I don't at all have a kind of doctrinaire feeling about that 1 acre. I'm totally fine considering some expansion into it, assuming it's that community serving thing that we've all said is pretty cool.
Well, I think my issue is more that from the half to the east should be public, and if that ends up being our
Public serving, building.
public serving, right, that it's, but it's basically public.
Sure.
So I think I'm agreeing with you.
Well, and
Gary?
to go on your point, when you look at the original park designs that we were playing with before the election of that time, we were playing with different sizes. It was no half acre. It was playing with sizes and playing with putting community buildings on the community-owned piece. And so that's where the difference is. It wasn't like it was an inviolate, you have to stop it, but it has to be a community building. And by community means community, either community-owned or fully open to the community. And the way Ryan has kind of put this out there is kind of creating that to be part of the anchor use here. And that, then you start to get into what does that look like. We have some examples, because Harry Teague already did some, at least help when we were doing this whole community look at this. There are those designs out there. They could be, just, it's a lot of reference, and it's very difficult because you have 7 people and they all have different backgrounds, and you're trying to design this whole piece. But in the end, what we're trying to do is give them direction of, here's where we would accept some housing, here's where we would love to see the commercial aspect of it, be it an office, be it nonprofit, be it art-based, be it chamber, and then here's where we want to see the public serving park piece. And so that's really what we're trying to give guidance on, and those pieces in the middle will be filled in as you design it, because until we come up with those areas and what we'd like to see, I don't know if we could say we want a beer garden right there. I mean, we want to see public serving. A beer garden could be a potential use. So,
But again, I suppose if the objective is to have some fraction of this property public serving, again, there's nothing in my mind that says it has to be on one corner or another. It can't be in the center or off-center. If the objective of vibrancy is to bring people together, frankly, it's not about providing only a place for our townsfolk to get together, which is only 4,000 of us. It's about creating a destination for people from outside of our town, from Carbondale or Snowmass, to come down. And much as I love the art space, there's no evidence to suggest that that has created vibrancy thus far, as is across the street. And there's certainly no evidence in my mind to suggest that having the 2 acres of park has in any way contributed to vibrancy. This is part of the problem. So if we're talking about introducing elements that are going to create a destination for people from inside our community and outside of our community, I think we have a lot of the right elements. The art space, I love. The chamber, maybe. Moving what it would effectively be kind of the upstairs of town hall over to that side. We've talked about the notion of having town hall on that side of the road, and I think we've abandoned that because it didn't seem like optimal use. But let's say, for instance, on top of your eateries, you had office space. And I know the syndrome of Willits, but it seems to me from personal expressions to me that there might be a market for a limited amount of office space to begin to capitalize on what we have written about in our own documents as the nexus of RMI, Roaring Fork Conservancy, as kind of a hub of nonprofits. So, again, as I've commented, I think we're moving in a direction that makes a lot of sense, and we need to find the reason for people to come. What is it about this that will make this a destination? The residential won't make it a destination, but it is important, and to the extent that it is replacement housing, I think that's absolutely the right optic on this, absolutely positively. But what beyond that, it could be a modest amount of office. You know, and this is my basic point, is that I feel like we have been forced into this box, and there are doctrinaire positions that have been staked out that simply restrict the options that you, the developers, have to contemplate.
Can I add, just, I think there's common ground here, which is that this group hasn't said that second floor has gotta be something.
Right.
We've said that this should be designed.
It could
And
work.
if it's, hey, ring it with a few office spaces, that's fine with me. I don't know the answer.
Right.
But someone does.
And I think that was part of the idea that Brian brought to us.
That was part of the thinking, is thinking about office as its demand calls for today isn't necessarily an office where you go in and close the door. We heard at the event the other day that by 2020, something like 50% of the working folks in the country will be working remotely. And so I think being able to capture that and kind of utilize the data that we have at hand for things that we see as emerging. This isn't a building for today necessarily. It's a building for the next 25, 35 years. And so what's to come? And I think that we need to consider that. And I think that the work that the chamber is doing on this kind of gets us some new ideas. There is a lot of advancement in food and beverage with I used the word whimsical with Tim not too long ago. I love that word, and I think that yeah, it gets us thinking about what this place could be, and I think that food and beverage component, if treated correctly, doesn't compete with our existing restaurants in downtown. It adds to. It makes the pie bigger. It appeals to perhaps a different thought pattern on a given night. There's times when I'm not going to go out and sit down at a restaurant, but if I can go grab a quick bite, I'm still out. I'm still, present in the community with my family. And so I think that it's those kind of things. And then the other thing I want to mention, and part of the reason and thinking behind having ownership by the town is, we keep talking about this park, and the park is going to bring part of the vibrancy. I think you need to have a connection with that and this building. We haven't started to design what the park can look like, neither the building. But to do those in concert, I think gets us so much closer to being able to create that end game. And I think that with the town, I think ultimately there is going to be some responsibility that falls on our shoulders to program, because the person that owns the restaurant isn't going to program the park. And so I think that we've got to think of it in a more holistic sense if we're really going to make that corner as vibrant as we all want it to be. So, that was sort of the thinking and the brainstorm that we had this week on that and the why.
Super exciting.
So I think we got a lot of good feedback on the physical.
I just did want to take note of the fact that I don't really think Auden Schindler would say whimsical.
He might.
Saw me short.
All right, it's not short, I was selling tall. Okay, so should we move on, since we have?
So now we get to the big residential question, okay? And I think this is where Tim's gonna need some direction, so he can continue with his refinement. I think he's taken a lot of cues tonight. You've already sort of expressed this a bit. But as it relates to the residential, we have continued that conversation. We've talked about, there's different types. There's affordable or attainable housing, there's market rate housing, there's for lease housing, there's for sale housing. There's different sizes. We've talked about these micro units. We've talked about townhomes. And what we want to do is try to get some feedback on that from you and talk about the different residential uses and kind of what you have in mind. Some of you have spoken on that already, but if there's anything to add, I think that that could be really valuable for Tim.
Well, can we also just circle back to the CSC zoning was 1,400 square, what's the cap?
14, I think it's 1,400, is that correct?
And some of the proposed were
James,
24, and then there's, on top of that, there's deed restricted. So I think that we should weigh in on that again, so that you get a consistent read from us. So is council willing to entertain residential uses in the project? And I would just, let's go a little bit farther and say to what extent, or looking like what?
I think having a range,
A
a
range.
range, I think would be
That's a
good
good
if
idea.
we can get to that.
So I'm gonna
Would you
ask.
say that's accurate, Tim?
Yeah, and please speak to those types.
Range
You were touching on it
types.
earlier.
Yeah.
Sale, lease, micro, bigger.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you to kick it off on.
Okay, well, let me kick it off in terms of what I think council's gonna have to consider. A few things. One is we are, in response to this proposal, council generally uniformly said they're too big, we want them smaller. So there's gonna be some level of free market housing that we're gonna have to swallow to enable this development. And it's smaller than what we saw. And the question for council is, okay, I think it's for you too, Tim, it's how much, given what we sketch out, how much do you need to make it work? And for council is, how much can you accept? And size. So that's it, whether it's 7 or 15 or 20, we have to figure that out together. So that's gonna be there, and it's for sale, free market, condo, townhouse. Then we said, we would like to see small, maybe micro, maybe really creative, deed-restricted, affordable housing. I don't know whether it should be rent or own, that can be up for discussion, on the eastern side of the parcel to address replacement housing, to address basically our comfort with having gotten rid of all those trailers and now, we should be replacing them with something. So my feeling is that if we can come to some agreement between this necessary free market piece and then a desired deed-restricted, affordable, dense, creative, fun, park underneath, whatever. There are lots of interesting models of this, that we could get there. I think a developer could make money on that higher density piece if we allowed that density. And again, I'm not saying make New York City there. Let's come to a compromise. But I think those are the two pieces of housing that are gonna make this work. And then everything else works around it. And the last thing I'll say in terms of the boundaries of the parcel is I'm flexible. If it needed to creep a little toward the river so that we could have more park in the big V, I'm okay with that. I'm just saying, I don't think that existing parcel the town owns has to be, a rigid line too.
Can you go a little more down the road of range, type, deed restricted, free market? Do you have any boundaries on that, or?
Like number?
I don't know. I don't know what we're,
Well, this is where things get, councils always say, I think 20 is the right number. And the developer says, where'd you get that?
Yeah.
Well, I pulled it out of my ass, Like it's not, I don't wanna, what I wanna be in the situation is, I want there to be a component of you saying, this is what I need, and we'll assess that. We're not gonna take your word for it, we'll say, is this appropriate? And then we'll say, we think as a group, we can accept X amount of affordable housing at what density and what size. I mean, Aspen Skiing Company's been working with really small units that are pretty cool, and there's a demand for that in the community, both rental and, for ownership. So I'm reluctant to say X number, but maybe we should kind of sketch the parameters using that as a starting point, because that was what? How many units is that?
28 units, I believe, total.
28 with 5 deed restricted? 6?
So-
Okay.
2 plus 6.
Okay, so the
So the total was
council didn't
28?
like that number.
okay,
But you're saying it was a means to an end. There is vibrancy created inherently with people being there. And a variety of types of uses sounds okay.
Mhm.
and I think too that I, for one, always want to get the cart before the horse on the pro forma, but you can't really ask for a pro forma to be looked at until you come up with these numbers, which is why I think we have to be a little bit specific in throwing something out so he has something to come back with. So for me, I could deal with a limited amount of free market with equal amount of either, I would have to just say deed restricted. A limited amount of free market and a limited amount of deed restricted on the pretty far west. And I would say half or less than the original number is where I would feel conversational.
Quickly, a micro unit is approximately how many square feet?
600
Or less.
or less.
It's the basalt version, because a true micro unit's about half
Itty
that.
bitty.
Yeah.
450, you'll see something along those lines.
Okay. Well, I'll just jump to B really quickly, because that's the easy one. Definitely one on the west side of the parcel, as it has been in this application. If it were micro units, that would be obviously a rental pool. There was a comment from Bach saying that when it came to the deed restricted, that the one bedrooms were less desirable than a two bedroom. So I know that that goes against the micro unit concept, but maybe if there was some mix, like you'd have more potential variety and vitality.
It's done.
You can have micro two-bedroom.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the ski code does.
yeah, I mean, but that's like, I'm thinking more like families. A micro unit is not for a family.
It wouldn't be 450, you'd have to grow it. but-
Yeah, but even then, I can't imagine living in a tiny house with children.
We can address that.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, that would be my, my big, compromise is having any residential uses and pushing more towards affordable and smaller. It seems like you guys discussed that at the last council meeting, that you're looking at up to what, 2,100 square feet? Which I think is, too large. And then, I'm sorry, earlier we were talking about Art Base, and you're saying that they would buy the parcel from you, or from the CDC, and
The
you,
application was to gift it to them. The discussions lately have been asking, I have not been involved in
No,
that.
Tim has not
Okay.
been involved. We
Okay.
just had an offline discussion
Oh, okay.
of it being a possibility. I mean, they
Sure.
didn't say, yes, we want to buy it, instead
So
of
if-
get it for free.
yeah,
But-
so if that's the scenario of a nonprofit purchasing that parcel, then your pressure to have 28 housing units
Helps.
is slashed, hopefully. Because right now, it seems, it's too much housing for my,
It's a
for
relief
my
on the pro
taste.
forma to have that,
Mhm.
if they're willing.
And
Could I add super quick that if, Jackie, if you say less units than what we see now, as you said, but these are big units and we've said downsize them, so it's not fair to say, well, it was 28, now it's gotta be 16. Well, it should be more because we've downsized them and said we want more smaller units, right? So I think let's just not use that 28 as the, it's
The
gotta be
number.
15 now.
Right. Well, all I can say is that it's scooching out into the part where we would be talking about doing a public mini development ourselves. So then that would put us all the way across the park. All the way across.
One of the things, just for clarification too, and I think that's an important part of the discussion and consideration with number of units is it will come down to the pro forma, in the sense that, how do you, you're gonna pay so much for the land, so much for developing and getting that land ready, as it relates to infrastructure and whatnot. And so you have that component, for it. But then also, if we're, talking about, some contribution to that public serving piece too, that has an implication on the number of units or not. And it's not necessarily a reason to increase the number, but just something to be aware of, that, I think there is perhaps some nice balance in there if we have a desire to get some contribution towards that end.
Dr. Slack?
I guess my question goes to, I think density is appropriate on that piece of property. And I'm totally for affordable, well-managed affordable housing. But is that the right place to put it? Yes, we need to replace the housing that we've taken away, but this is like the primest piece of property, you know, we've talked about bigger things in the park across the street, and how could you, you know, I just think putting affordable housing in a spot where you can get the max amount of dollars, not that I'm trying to pad Tim's pocket, but I'm trying to make the thing work. I just wonder, is there somewhere else that you can put replacement housing to offset this, to increase density, grow the park more? I don't know, just thinking, you know. And I go back to what Gary said, when we removed the people from the park, it was, we aren't gonna put people living back in this floodplain, and now all of a sudden we're
It's fine.
putting people back in the floodplain. Well,
It's been fixed.
Well,
Yeah,
yes,
it's out, it is out of the floodplain. Yeah.
and Ryan, just,
flooding into the park.
just so you know, over the last 5 years, we have talked more than once about, you know, a private development going there with whatever it was, and putting the affordable housing piece of it on our already owned public parcel, which is it called? Is it
Reno?
Reno. So, I mean, it has come up before, so it's an obvious thing to ask.
Yeah, so that's just where I wonder, why can you do a trade in that?
I'd go back to kinds of the principles if we're going to ask about residential. And we're currently working on a strategy, and one of the things we want to promote is local economic development. Part of that will be predicated to the construction of, or the provision of, affordable, attainable housing. So the question about appropriateness, yep, you know, I would check that box and say, yeah, it's as appropriate here as it is anywhere. If we've all talked about density, I would argue that dense is probably better than not dense, because dense will suggest that you're dealing with primary homeowners who will actually slip out at night and go spend money at a local area. So that contributes to the vibrancy. The only other elements that I would add, if we as a town are committed to climate action and therefore things that are green, would be to look at, you know, kind of the construction and the ways that we can integrate green technology into these residential units. But the concept is, I think, consistent with what we're trying to do in the town, and it's not inconsistent with anything we have seen come out of either the DAC or the Our Town process. Our Town didn't say residential was their highest priority, but they didn't say it wasn't a priority either. So it all depends how you read those statistics. So I think it's completely appropriate, but how and what and where, that, again, for you guys. I guess the only other principles that I am actually pretty interested to defend are principles about public ownership of stuff. So, Ryan and I discussed this morning, but the notion of having this multi-purpose building be government-owned, I don't think we want to do that. The government hasn't exhibited any capacity to manage stuff anywhere, and in fact, we tend to privatize state-owned, municipally-owned things. So I would really suggest that your model not presume that the town will spend money to build a building and that we would have the resources to manage the eateries or program the events or any of that. That would be inconsistent with what I believe to be the role and function of government. And in the same way, the presumption about how much or not of a parcel of land we might buy, the town's voted not to use public funds through a debt offering. I don't think it's much less than a shell game if we simply use other funds, not debt finance, to procure land. So those are the only principles that I would also argue I would want to respect. I would want to have the private sector shoulder the risk, the responsibility of a private partner, and we as the government will do what we can to facilitate your process, to regulate and legislate in ways that help you do your job.
I think that goes against the proposal that you were suggesting, Ryan, and don't you have experience in Buny or Salida?
Yeah.
Of this model actually working? I think, Bill, I don't necessarily think you're wrong on any of your points, but I'm trying to get there. And I think the model you're suggesting is town ownership in part. And, you know, if we need to outsource that eventually, but I'm trying to get us there.
I think that you can draw from examples, as I alluded to, a few, where, our closest being Aspen. Stubby's is in a county-owned building. That's just a hop, skip, and a jump away. In Silverthorne, there's a model for a large event center that's town-owned. It's managed by a town employee. They have a number of weddings there throughout the year. And so, I think there are successful models, and we'd certainly want to look at those and really understand what it is that this investment means. And I think the idea of having these revenue-generating components to it would help to offset those new costs for that employee that could run it. Yes, the private sector has certainly proven that they can own property, build property, manage property. In this instance, I think we've dictated a certain outcome on this property that, has such a tight nexus to the public sphere, so we want a park. We want that park to be vibrant. We want it to be programmed. We want it to be not passive, but active. And I think that this building becomes an extension of that. And while yes, it's an additional service provided by the town, but if we're smart about it, I think we get there through the creation of the restaurant piece, the place where people pay to have events and weddings. If we're able to pursue the co-working space, so I think there's a model for this to be successful there. And also, if Tim says, no way, I'm taking this on, I want to manage it, I want to own it, then I think we have that conversation. Right now, it's just an idea, and I think that's why we're here talking about it.
And if I can just add to that, Ryan and I have talked about this, and as well as myself and other people. We would like to see something come in that looks like, sort of like Rawls' proposal. Everybody says, oh, that's very cutesy and everything, but we could sit here for 5 more years, and what we really see come in is much bigger developments. We see condo hotels come in. We see this pretty massive housing project come in. I think that it's unrealistic to ask a developer to get in the game of creating community spaces that we want when it's not potentially viable investment for a developer to do that. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if the simplistic way to do this would be to say, Tim does his housing development on the far west, whatever that ends up being, he sells a piece of the pie to the art base and sells the rest of it to the town, and he walks away, he builds his housing, which is the only place he's gonna make any money and not be stuck here for decades trying to, as in Willits, make it come around for commercial. Let him go. Cut him loose. Let him build the housing.
Financial contribution though, right? Isn't he participating in this?
Well, that is the plan, but if he spends much less money on his parcel and just builds housing, he doesn't have as much skin in the game. He gets the gravy and is potentially more likely to get out quicker and with more money in his pocket so that he can partner in the other piece of the game. So it's just a thought. It seems like we are expecting a developer to come in here with a community answer that we would love to see, and I don't think developers necessarily can afford to spend the time or money or are interested in doing it that way.
Well, we have one at the table. We could ask you. I mean, that's the whole deal. We're saying we want community benefit. They want to do development that makes profit. So that's the conversation.
Right.
I think, what do you think?
Yeah, that's what this is about. I think we're getting there. The reference to Rawls
Is it Royal's paper that you're talking about? Is that Royal's presentation?
I don't know who,
This was Mark Krasinski's presentation. It was
I
the
don't
same
know. Anyway.
I just want to clear the air on that in talking with them, and I have, that didn't run through a pro forma, that at least so, I think you might have said cutesy project. Well, adopt what we can. I see that as good neighbors trying to help out. That's how I've characterized it with them directly. But we'll kind of get into some of these concepts. I think we're wanting to get to the next thing, which is, okay, no feedback, what you got? And we should probably get to that. But I don't want to leave residential without also talking about and acknowledging we can't really process too much of it now, parking. When you get to micro, when we get to small scale, tighter units, we're going to need to grapple with some concessions on the standard parking counts, and P and Z recognize that too.
That was one of the only additions, sorry for
I just want to make sure we didn't.
But I would
ignore that.
say it does strike me, what? I can't.
Are we okay?
who's even talking.
Hello?
You, Bill, you're facing this way. Tim, you're hard because your back is to us.
Yeah, but he should be projected.
Should we mic?
Okay, I'll work on it.
I was gonna say, again, accepting that residential may be a viable use of the land, it does strike me that there are gonna be some binding constraints that we may not be able to get around, and parking was the one that I was going to add. There's going to be a limit, and then we can use that to reverse engineer how many spots, how many cars per family, how many families, there you've got your math.
And there's some good models.
And I don't know what that number is, frankly, so, no idea.
I'm flexible on that parking point, and we discussed at the last meeting that if there is, a project at some point that requires some level of parking structure, this council could be open to that conversation.
okay, I'm just gonna say, we're gonna maybe jump forward a little bit, to the density massing. So this is sort of a higher level question, and it's one that we, as, people in the community are bringing up to me. Is the scale of the proposed development generally acceptable? Generally acceptable.
And I think that's the scale that was presented, that essentially kind of matches RMI on the west and starts to step down as you move east or
And it's hard to
upriver.
tell a little bit from just this.
From that plan view,
Right.
correct.
But, Gary, you start.
For the massing, I mean, to me, I think Tim listened to the entire discussions when we were talking to Lowe's, and they were proposed, they couldn't come below 85,000 square feet. He heard it pretty clearly that somewhere around 50,000 square feet would kind of be that magical amount. For me, it's the size and scale to fit with the town. And that's why I always have a problem with the density piece, because when you talk density, you're going third, fourth, 2.5 floors, the step back floors. You gotta really sit and look at downtown. You don't want this to be a step up from downtown. I want this to be totally within character of downtown. And so scale and massing, taking out how much housing and how much commercial, it was starting to look, more in the realm of matching what you see in RMI and Roaring Fork Conservancy, and it wasn't this large development plonked into this parcel. And so, the massing wasn't my biggest issue here. It was the amount of residential compared to commercial and community serving.
Another interesting thing for you guys to explore too is, I think we heard a little bit that there had been a contemplation for some units, row home units that are sort of that front stoop look, and that they were blocking the views. And I think that's a question to ask: is there a desire to have sort of more openings throughout the project? Obviously, the big V being the big one, but that's kind of what we want to get to from this too. I think you answered the question well, but is there room for that interface with Two Rivers Road with an appropriate scale? But what about those penetrations back into
Like
the
little
park area?
streets, sort of.
Well, I think if you,
View corridor.
for me, it was getting more community serving, you're gonna have to provide a way to, you're not gonna block people's way to get to all this community serving stuff. So, appropriate design with more community serving would allow more, opportunities to get through the building. You know, the reality is you're protecting that big connection to the park and the river through the front parts, the western, the eastern part of this parcel. So what you're doing as you're stepping back towards RMI is, you know, important to make sure that it's community inviting, but, you know, adding more view to river through there. I would love to see how you can get more community serving first, making it open to that public. So, that's my point.
Bye, Gary. Okay. I guess he's tired of
A
this.
big boy, just go.
Okay, goodbye. Anybody else have a thought on the scale? I'm kind of losing my voice. You got anything?
I think that Gary described it really well.
Okay, I do too.
That with these new elements, this is gonna change the design and add
Right.
more viewpoint.
So, Auden, did you?
Oh, I
have
just
something?
think it's not that clear what we would accept. I mean, for me, you can't have it all. You can't have the density and the access to the river. I'm not sure, I'm gonna ask Gary when he came back, what did he mean community serving? This is residential, so it's not community serving. So let's find out what he meant by that. I mean, my feeling is that up against the RMI parcel, that's where your replacement, affordable, deed-restricted, smaller micro housing goes, because it's high up there. Presumably it steps down to the park, though, as you all know, I'm okay with height. So it's higher on that end, and then you have, that's where your affordable is, and then you have free market where it is now. But I gotta say, I'm not doctrinaire about that. If a designer says, no, it works better this way, Auden, that's fine with me. I'm sort of starting to think about what is this gonna, how are we gonna get to a number, you know, an appropriate size and number? And I think that's probably useful for council to discuss a little bit. It's sort of doing what I said we didn't want to do, which is arbitrary number picking, but
What kind of number? You mean units or
Yeah.
square feet or
yeah,
height or?
number, I think.
Square foot.
You almost get
Coach
there
me?
when you refer to replacement housing.
Yeah,
Are you relating that to the number of mobile homes that are gone?
yes, yeah, but we can't even we're never gonna get close to that scale. So we're gonna do some replacement housing. It's gonna be dense, it's gonna be massed, and then the free market stuff is gonna be the opportunity to be less, you know, be more open maybe, I don't know.
And I don't think we are totally clear or are on the same page about whether it is gonna be dense and how dense. So I think you're right, we are not, I mean, I kind of threw numbers out.
Well,
but
let me
nobody else is.
bounce back to that. Our common ground, and everyone correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's gonna be some free market stuff, and there's gonna be some affordable, deed-restricted, smaller, and everything smaller than that. Is that, everyone agree with that?
I think.
Okay, so the number there is 28, of that, 6 were affordable?
Right.
Okay, so let me try something here, and again, this is just a place to start. If 28 big units was too much, would 28 units as a number still be okay if a whole bunch of them were micro? So in other words, maybe 18 of them are small affordable housing pushed off to the side, and then the condos that are the financial benefit of the project, 10 of them, again, these are just numbers, are there. Is that okay to council? So we're doing what council wanted, which is we're downsizing the size of the houses. We're adding much more affordable housing, but we're still enabling free market to finance the project.
I always wanted no housing there. That's what I wanted, no housing. And I still am not a big fan of housing there. I would probably be more likely to live with, as I said, half this number, which is 14, and have half of those be big and half of them be really small, to get them way west and leave us room to do this community kind of activity sort of thing of watching the kids ice skate. That's, to me, what this park is for. I think that housing can be built anywhere in the world. This is the only place of its kind anywhere on the confluence of two rivers. And I agree with Ryan that why would you pile up a large amount of any kind of housing, affordable housing to me, or any kind, just because it's the highest and best use for an investor. It's not my highest and best use. My number one deal is Central Park for our community. That's what my highest and best use is, and everything else is after that to me. And we're not on the same page, but we're much closer.
Can I
Yeah.
push back in our
Push away.
friendly
Push away.
way? I think the answer to that is, we took off, what, 200
No,
beds?
100 and a quarter.
Well, okay, 100
Well,
and a quarter.
beds
What-
or
Beds.
units.
Beds is
There's a
probably.
It was
lot.
like 400
Okay,
sleeping.
so a ton of affordable housing went away. The reason I'm saying we put it there is twofold. One, because it's embarrassing to get rid of all that housing and not replace it. Two, the park is huge. We're gonna make this thing a huge, awesome, well-programmed park, and you got it. But the housing, in particular, the affordable, because people are there all the time, is what enables the vibrancy and the economics of the battery of the town to work. Again, that coffee shop, CC's, will fail without more people living downtown. And so that's what I'm saying, is this is part of your vision of the park, is, let's call it 20 micro units, and they're coming down and they're going to the park and hanging out. That's it. So you can't just say park without
Sold,
people.
20 micro units.
Okay.
My question to you, Alden, is 20 people aren't gonna provide everything for the park. I think this notion of once again, affordable housing is insanely important in this valley, and we cannot function without it. But this grand idea of 20 micro units with 20 working people,
Or 40.
or 40, fixing the quote-unquote vitality of our park or our town, 40 people isn't gonna tip the scale. I mean, is it gonna help? Yeah, but it's not,
Yeah.
we need it, but to me, is that the best place for it?
But just to return that, it's not the answer, it's part of the community. Right now, CC's doing okay with what we have, but we're saying, let's goose that a little bit to create that level of vibrancy. By the way, the free market units, in theory, are gonna do that too. Hopefully, they're not gonna stand empty, and people are gonna go to Tempranillo and Free Range and so forth. So it's a piece of it. It's not the answer. But the other thing is, we talk about housing, and we don't have, like, by the time we put housing on Marina, we're all gonna be retired. You know, like, we aren't cranking out the micro affordable housing. So this is being opportunistic too.
But we could put housing on Merino.
You
And,
put all the micro housing on Merino,
yeah,
and I don't know, that's what I'm asking.
I just wanna play in reality, not in what could be. And Merino, I'd love to do Merino, and it's beautiful because you can build high, just like
Right.
the building next to it. But let's do that too. I mean, we know what we're aspiring to in terms of housing.
yeah. It's just, it could be part of this conversation. It has been in the past. It comes and goes, whether we want to include other parcels in the discussion or not. I think it's still something worth talking about. If, especially, you know, if like Gary and I think Katie don't really want that much housing there, we gotta find a way to mitigate the housing part of it. So I don't think we're gonna get that answer tonight.
Let me ask just a kind of process or reality question. Is Merino even something that we could say, okay, we want to reduce housing on the park, take this parcel and put it there? And
It's
then-
ours.
But isn't there, Ryan, we talked about this, there's permitting, there's like a gas line, I mean, would this just gum things up forever and we shouldn't even be talking about it, or is it realistic?
I think that there's a sewer line that runs through there, not a gas line, and runs through the back part of it. It's a very small parcel. And then you run into the issue of parking there as well. And so some of the discussions that we've been talking about also for Tim's development is right now we use it as parking. Can that be enhanced to add some spaces to it and be part of the solution for some of the micro units perhaps that could be located on Tim's proposal? And could you put, I mean, to answer your question plainly, could you put housing over there? Probably so. But if you're putting micro units over there, you know, you're surrounded by roads on all sides, and you know, there's some challenges that come up.
So to be clear, you're saying Merino might play a role, but it might be parking to enable the housing on the existing parcel.
And also the large vehicle parking.
Like kind of the pull through for boats or people, like if there is sort of the visitor center, school buses, things like that.
High-speed electric vehicle charging stations and that.
So anyway, it's our parcel, we can do whatever we want to with it, and we've talked about it for housing before. And so maybe we aren't gonna solve all of this right now, but let's just jump to this last one about, does council feel that there is a need for an urban designer to help the council in evaluating the application?
And I want to frame this one
Frame
a little
away.
bit for you.
They want to
So,
replace me, they're trying to get me.
first of all, if we go and we seek an urban designer, you know, I think that there's obviously a cost associated with that, particularly if you're flying somebody in and out. So that's just one component for you all to think about. The second is, we've seen a sort of a first brush at what's possible on this site, and I think there's going to be more opportunity for interaction with these guys even tonight to look at some concepts, but then flesh it out a little bit more. And so I guess just if you want a recommendation as you lead into this, you have a professional planning staff who are evaluating these and have education specifically in urban design, and are attending the national conferences and seeing what others are doing. And so I think that there could be a place for an urban designer to kind of to help with context, but just it may not yield the results that you're hoping for if, in fact, a second rendition that we get from Tim starts to look and feel a lot more like what you were hoping to see on the property. So I just want to, because of the financial piece of it, I want you to think that one through
Well,
a little bit. And
let me-
we'll do what
Let me ask
you want,
this,
yeah.
if we decide to go that route, how long would it take to get that trigger pulled?
Well, it would depend on the capacity of the person.
No, I mean to actually select someone.
Well, in the procurement policy, the council does have a way to sort of waive the procurement if there's a specific person that you have in mind. And so that could shorten that a little bit. But then, of course, you've got to call and say, hey, you know, what's your schedule? If they're coming from far away, you know, they theoretically, if they're good, they're having other work and stuff like that, so they've got a schedule. It could be a few weeks.
Well, and I am not sure that we've talked about it enough for me to know that we even have been pushing towards someone from LA versus someone from Aspen.
Right.
Just a new,
Yeah.
you know, somebody who hasn't been in this room before would be, you know, great. So I don't know how this council's appetite is for this. I would love to hear.
Can I ask your question, that if we do procurement, it's probably 60 days.
I'm fine not doing it in the short term, but I think it depends on us being clear enough with what we're trying to get to, and unanimous, hopefully, that Tim and company can go back and try to recreate that. I don't want to be vague, drag them through the mud, and then be cranky about the next thing they bring. So I think if we can here come to we have, I think, agreed on general parameters, but can we get more specific? I mean, are we getting closer to something they can understand?
I mean, are we in fact only talking about housing? Because I think that's all we're talking about.
Everything else we agree on, right? Mostly, or no?
I mean,
Kinda sort
there
of,
is
really.
the,
I mean, there are a lot of moving
so
parts.
maybe just a second, Bill, maybe there is, let's assume for now that there is a scenario where we go forward with the idea that Ryan has proposed. So we do this public sort of development, for lack of a better, and create those things that we want and that we want to give the community at possibly a reduced cost, which is one of the reasons why we would do this. So we do that, and the art base buys their parcel. What else are we asking from Tim? I don't see what else we're asking from Tim.
Participation in the,
Well, right, participation, but I mean, as far as like coming back with iteration after iteration of, unless he wants to take on this, like, basically subsidized commercial venture, I don't know what we want from him.
well, we're asking him to downsize what he proposed.
Sure, so we're talking about housing.
Yeah.
That's all we're talking about.
Commercial.
And commercial.
What commercial?
Which commercial?
Well,
And, shared office spaces. If there's commercial, it'd be part of the discussion too.
I'm sorry.
If there's commercial, that'd be part of this discussion also, Jacqueline.
Okay, so if there is commercial and you're interested in this subsidized mini development,
well, it's
I think
not,
what
Yeah.
Tim's saying is that on his side, he's talking about more than just residential, that he's also trying to work in some extra commercial components that are
Vitality.
outside our,
Yeah.
our scope of our public serving building. He has some iteration that he'd like to tell us
well,
about.
sure, I would say that's a great idea, see if it flies.
Okay.
I'd say that's but I'm just thinking, I mean,
But-
we're gonna go, it seems to me like we're gonna go one way or the other on the commercial. Either it's gonna be this publicly owned, or it's
Or
gonna be,
nonprofit.
or not, or true,
Nonprofit. Yeah, there was-
nonprofit.
Just more there than just residential.
Oh, that's true, offices,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, maker spaces, right?
Everyone
Yeah.
has supported that.
right.
yeah.
And I think one of the biggest pieces is saying the residential is in western portion, that commercial piece is kind of the central, and then the public serving, potentially this, public serving piece is right next to the piece that's the park.
Is basically the,
Right, but the commercial piece in the
main.
middle is still in play, because he's not just gonna magically give it to the art base. This could be a nonprofit thing, this could be offices, this could be some other iteration where they think
Okay.
of. So I look at this, trying to give them parameters on where these pieces connect, and how do we work all those pieces together.
and I think that we've pretty well said that part about location of this versus this, right?
I think so.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that we've worked really, really hard for the last couple hours here,
We have.
and I don't know if we've gotten where you had hoped and we had hoped, but it seems like we've gotten quite a bit on the table.
Oh, I think it's been great. I'd hoped it would be a couple
Sorry.
hours of this kind of back and forth and interchange. I've been really quiet with Rich. I noticed the key's been under here. And, are you at this point wrapping up, and would you like us
I
to
think
show
so.
some things? Yeah, some ideas and responses? You know, we we maybe had to be presumptuous in terms of where some of this would go, and we've been working with staff and others, meeting with people to collect more and more feedback. So, you know, we did need to, as we worked on this and have been talking about it, take a stance on certain ideas. So you'll see some fundamentals, and then building into that, more specifics. But this is a sketch plan. We're not here with hard numbers. We just aren't. And I didn't think we wanted to get that deep, but the concepts that we've been working on, I think, are going to reflect a lot of the feedback that we've had. I think that some big things here that, I know there's discussion about park and the appropriateness of that, but we've assumed that there's a park. We didn't take it as literally as the 50% and that line. There's at least two ways of looking at that. It's the calculation of the number of square feet. Is that 50-50? And then there's that line up there, or the multiple lines, and where they are and what that means in terms of numbers. So there's an intentional looseness to that, but we're trying to integrate that into what we're doing here. Downsizing the residential and looking for ways to, what we kind of didn't address are some of the criticisms of, you know, high-end residential and second homeowners. And from the developer standpoint, you try to make the most you can on every square foot you got. So, because it'll thin it out. So if we're now looking to have lower price points, that's cool, but it's also going to bring some trade-offs. Same would go for those view lines through the project from Two Rivers Road to the river, which is part of the master plan requests. That means we're taking areas that are otherwise part of the development, and instead of them being vertical and providing profitability of the project, they're going to be site costs, and so we might have to get a little more elbow room out of that at the end of the day. So I'll turn it over to Rich. I know you've been.
I can't wait to talk. I don't get to talk.
You've been elbowing me a little bit. I got bruises right here. But if we can hang in there, I think we've got 30 or 40 minutes of it. Hopefully we can kind of hang in there.
Whatever makes sense. Yeah.
Whatever makes sense.
Okay. Well, what Tim and I have talked about is to go through a few diagrams that speak to what we heard about before this meeting, but I think they speak to a lot of what you guys just shared. And I agree that was terrific to hear directly more detail and more specificity from all of you. So I will try to address that as we go through some sketches and diagrams and ideas. I know there's a really nice spectrum, however, still of kind of how dense or how not dense, and so we can talk about that as we go through this, okay?
It'd be okay with us if anybody wants to come up and look around.
And I think
Actually,
that's fine, and we're also going to try to stream it, so the folks in the audience will see it from the camera, but if you guys want to look over their shoulder, by all means, please.
And you guys might need to gather around a little too. I know this seems very rudimentary, but that was intentional, to try to step back and think about the kind of things you guys are talking about. So here's the proposal that you've already seen, okay, to get everybody located. Here, of course, is the Roaring Fork River, Two Rivers Road. Here's the main intersection in town, and here's the expansion of the park that we've talked about so much. And the V comes through, it does come through right about here. So there is a little bit of this little proposal that goes over that line of the V. These bubbles, we sketched to try to discuss a lot of the different moving pieces that you guys were just all articulating and talking about. So the notion of a key node that maybe would be developed by the town, that's the anchor, the food and beverage piece, the events piece. I hadn't heard about the office piece until this discussion, but the notion that this taking what I would call kind of the 100% corner, so it's got the best connection to both the park and to Two Rivers Road and to downtown Basalt. So it's a really smart and I think very strong place, assuming we're not developing more of the park, which all these sketches are assuming that we're not. In fact, this is now abiding by the V entirely, by the way. So having this corner be the place for that seems to make a lot of sense to us as a starting point. And the scale of it is significant, and more significant than we talked about in the previous proposal, but it's still not enormous from what I've heard. It's 2,000 or 3,000 feet of restaurant, I'm just looking at Ryan, but I think that's the kind of order of magnitude we're talking about. Is that correct? Okay.
Sure.
So, we have a client in Denver, by the way, who has developed something called Avante. Maybe
We
some
know
of you
it,
have heard about
yeah.
that. And it's much larger, but that idea I really connect with in terms of believing that it could have that incubator kind of quality in terms of chefs. What they've done there is they have 5 different cooking spaces. They have a shared back of house. They have shared food and shared beverage, the bar side. And they will switch out every 6 months. If a chef is successful and incubates here and goes to start his own restaurant, they'll have a new chef that comes into the space. So again, it's a different scale, but the idea of the excitement of all that culinary work happening in the town or the developer supporting the infrastructure that lets that happen has been very successful there, and they're now doing one in Kansas City, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be a great one for you guys to see at some point, or even online, it's helpful to see. And obviously, there's the beverage side, which includes the bar side, which fuels it making sense to some degree. And the notion of taking advantage of the second floor, I think, makes a lot of sense. I don't think it all needs to be one-story world here. I think the town of Basalt has a lot of history of 2-story, even some 3rd-story step back, and that, to me, is very much a part of the scale. And what we've talked about for a while, we're not talking about 4 stories, it's mostly 1 and 2 stories. Well, 2 stories, I would say. Occasionally, maybe some step back 3 stories here and there. So the idea of having some kind of flex space in sharing uses makes a lot of sense, at least from my perspective. There could be a new version of this space that's a little larger, and to have it work. We work in a lot of resort environments across the country, and there's always the challenge of how do you build the space, and if you can start using it for multiple things, it makes a lot of sense. There's challenges that come with it, but the sharing part of things is something I think we'll keep reiterating as we talk about these different ideas. So this corner made a lot of sense to us. I think the idea of getting as much vitality, as much commercial to go as far downriver, if you will, I think certainly makes sense to everybody I've talked to. And we're still assuming there's some version of residential, which is what this color is, by the way. Whereas these are more mixed uses or more commercial type uses, including the art base, and including, we did have some housing potentially mixed in on like levels 2 and maybe setback level 3s. That gets into a density question. To address your discussion of if we have micro housing, where would it go? I think that's a real important discussion. My gut reaction is I wouldn't put it over here. I would consider having it part of the more vibrant, more commercial mixed-use core. And I think those folks might be more amenable to being above the store, if you will, or above the office, whatever that might be. So just something to keep in mind. And having that be closer to Old Town Basalt, I think has a lot of logic to it. So the extra little color here is kind of that more mixed-use stuff, and this is more residential. I'll get to that in a minute. The notion of having more porosity from Two Rivers Road to the park and to the river, I think we always say that's really cool if we can afford it, or where should we afford it. But this diagram is starting to show quite a few. They may not be all really large, but the connectability through the project, which is both view-oriented and just circulation from a pedestrian standpoint, we think is really important. We had a version of it in the previous proposal that was smaller, but this notion is to really have, of course, really strong connections to the park and a strong edge off of the food and beverage piece and off of the town's community building. But also, if this was the art-based piece, one of the things we did when we did an initial concept across the street for the art base, which I know, Mayor, you were involved in those early ideas, you were part of our charrette and things, was to break down that building into 2 or 3 smaller scale elements. One was the gallery, one was the education spaces, and another was art studios. And to break it down into the scale that you'd see in Old Town Basalt, in terms of like 30-foot widths, those kinds of things. So that certainly could happen here, where this could be the gallery component, this could be the arts education component. And again, their program has been kind of 1.5 stories, so there might be some second story and some higher volume, like for an art gallery for the gallery might be 1.5 levels with the north light and a lot of sustainable kind of focus. We've talked about a roof space here as well, like the Aspen Art Museum, like a mini version of that for events and gathering for the art base. There was even some ideas I heard about, would you ever connect across and have an elevator here that works for both structures and those kinds of things. I think that's important to think about, because these still are fairly small structures, and things like 2 staircases and elevators get expensive. So it's just something in the back of our minds. So the porosity of this direction, north-south, I think is really smart. And I think the one, we didn't want to call it a proposal, but some of those images that some of the public were throwing forth had a real emphasis on that, and I think that's smart in a lot of ways. It also adds more edge and more light to the buildings, of course. And it adds a lot more pedestrian connection through the project. We thought that some other cross-circulation piece for pedestrians could be nice as well. Not that that's entirely new, but the notion of connecting through here.
Going through the art base is a big change.
And maybe going through the art base where it's actually two buildings with a vestibule that's usually open but closed at night or in bad weather, that kind of idea. So it's like an archway maybe connecting the vibrancy here to other uses here that we think, again, could be more mixed use than just fully residential. So the thought in this component was, could this be the micro-housing idea? And that would be particularly on levels 2 and maybe part of the 3rd floor, depending on how much mass we all feel is comfortable. And then the thought is on the ground floor, at least on this edge, that could be commercial space. That could be great maker space, which is a very trendy term, but, you know, working space, office space, it could be WeWork kind of space, all those kinds of ideas. And to have it be a maker space that abuts and connects with the art base, to me, has a lot of richness. And I can imagine that really being a powerful space, so that this almost alley-like space, or pocket gardens, or pocket park, if you will, that both one side of the art base connects to, and those offices connect to, or those maker spaces. You could just imagine artists being there, architects, of course, people inventing their new handbags, whatever the craft would be, could really make a lot of sense with the art base being as well. We talked about we could even have flexible changing art display on that side of the art base that helps animate that whole pedestrian experience. So this pedestrian experience is probably not as vibrant as this one, and this one's probably not as vibrant as this one, but they each are interconnected and are part of the the anchor, I guess, has been the term you guys have used. Interrupt me, by the way, if there's something that doesn't really make sense.
One comment I have is it's great. I love what you're saying about art base, but we have to assume art base isn't there for a while. You know, if it's there in a year and the fundraising goes great, that's awesome. But if to cause the model, it could be space that is vacant and we should have a dual use for it in the interim while the money's being raised.
For the site.
Yeah.
But I think you can with the way this is set up, because it's two.
Yeah.
They might be able to phase it better this way.
Mm-hmm.
I look at this and you phase one of these and you get, I like the phasing piece of this, because also it's, it's kind of, I don't know, I feel like you can, I know it's gonna take them a little while to raise the money to make it all happen, especially since they're gonna be part of this development, they might have to pay for some of this land. So, making sure that then you connect to the park for the time being is important, and it's not just a bare dirt.
There's a lesson learned from Willits here in terms of, it seems like if you go on one side of the building, where you really want to be is the other side of the building. So these larger blocks, it's good to find a way to get through them. As we talk about the maker space, we talk about that loosely. I am seeing downtown Basalt as having a lot of success with office space, small scale. These are 20-foot type depths. They could be for-profit or non-profit, private or public. They could be condominiumized commercial units that have really inherently a minimal demand on parking, and they're destinations. So they are 8 to 5 lights on, I would think. They are people who are there every day. I don't see this area being a site appropriate for much retail, if any at all. So in other words, destinations, salons, health, wellness. We've talked about this stuff, but a limited amount of that can anchor that new pedestrian corridor that I think the backside of the art base could really come alive too.
Yeah.
Maybe the Bernard's Alley times a little bit times 2 in width. Or we talked about that, Rich, and the way we pave it and those sort of things. Light it could be really an interesting pass through.
I think the conversation is point well taken in terms of phasing and viability. Of
Yeah,
course,
it
you could
is.
have that point with any piece of this too.
Right.
So you could debate, do we flip certain things
Yeah.
like that. One part of the idea here was if this was the micro housing, or let's just say real attainable apartments. Micro is a very trendy word. I think there's a limit of how tight would really make sense here in Basalt. We talked about it earlier. Maybe it's 400 feet kind of stuff and not 250, which you'd see in Tokyo or New York or something. But I think the parking piece of this is gonna be a huge driver, like we've already identified. And we haven't identified, well, how much are we all willing to evolve what our current code would say? And from my experience, I think that will be necessary, probably, to get what everybody's trying to find on balance here, some evolution of that, in some way to share more and not have to have a more suburban parking count, let's say. But just a thought to throw out to everybody. So one of the thoughts is that maybe that we have some covered parking that's accessed through here that allows there be some parking for all, let's call this residential, and to have, at least for the micro, some parking that is allowed to happen and happen underneath from this side. So that would one logic for the micro.
On grade.
On grade, and be affordable. So it would be behind what is that commercial space, which would face this way. The parking would be accessed from this. So that's one reason to have it here and not here, for example, because we're not having cars in this portion of it. And the thought is when we do allow cars in here, is to work really hard to have it really feel like a pedestrian landscaped environment that cars can drive on, so that it's not an alley that's all driven by car motions and all that kind of stuff, which means a little bit less cars than you would be able to max out, which means maybe more one-car garages for a few of the for-sale residents as opposed to two-car garages. Maybe they're double deep if that's necessary for the marketability of them. So we've started to talk about all these things, which are a little less conventional, but we think the market's getting to a point where it could make sense. And certainly for the micro-housing, I think having a much lower parking count than you normally have could really work for those units. We have amazing bus service here. We do have other places maybe we could park some. We've talked about some kind of auto sharing program that could work for the homeowners here, or for the residents here is a better way to say it, because there's probably rental and some for sale. And so the notion would be maybe have 2 or 3 vehicles that are part of a program for this community. And I have about 30 architects down the street, about half of them are pretty young, and would love to not have to have a car and be able to live in a place like this and be able on their app, get the Tesla 3 or something for the day, or sign up for the Jeep, or sign up for the pickup truck, or whatever is part of the program. So it doesn't mean we need to have some parking, but maybe it could be highly reduced from what's kind of looking back 20 years ago, what people thought was necessary. The thought for the housing here has been, let's work even harder on breaking down the scale and having there be more porosity and an even softer edge to the park. Now, this part of the park is where all the big cottonwood trees are, so it's already, to me, not as open and gregarious as this part of the park. And so the housing can kind of fit within that, not riparian, but, the next layer up from the river. We've talked about, would we think about these more like river cabins, or some analogy of thinking about how basalt's developed over the century plus. And there's certainly a lot of romance, I would say, and a lot of eclecticism to Old Town basalt. So that the architecture here would not be a project, but it'd be a series of smaller buildings that probably meld together quite a bit. And they may function like townhomes in a lot of ways, but they feel more like a residential neighborhood that's really comfortable, and it's on the edge of town. So this is a little bit more in town, and this is starting to get more on the edge of town. And therefore, it'd be even softer to the park and to the public. But this is our financial engine more than anything else, is what we're thinking. So as opposed to having this be the financial engine, this is very valuable, of course, facing south and on the river. And the thought we've had is that maybe this is where we remain to have our 50 units or whatever. No, I'm sorry. Just our 7 units, was it? Whatever it is. So, maybe it's our 10 units. Something like that kind of scale is literally what we've kind of been scribbling here. And there's one more scribble to show that's a little more specific in a minute. Then the thought is here that we still feel it makes sense to have this be residences. And one thing I mentioned to Tim, this was just yesterday, but could there be something in between the micro units and the for sale housing that helps the pro forma but provides more density and more housing and more attainable housing? And attainable's a good question of what's the definition of attainable. So not deed restricted, but it might be smaller than otherwise, certainly smaller than we've talked about in the previous proposals. So the thought could they be fairly efficient 2 and 3 bedroom apartments? They might be for rent. And they would be like an 800 or 825 square foot 2 bedroom and maybe 1,100 3 bedroom. The goal being to get them, it's a new building, so there's a certain reality of cost no matter what, but to provide nice housing that likely will be occupied full time and provide a fair amount of hotbeds and people and vibrancy. So I know there's a real question of, gosh, how many people do we, feel living here? There's a real difference between what you guys are saying in terms of the positiveness of building vibrancy and such. So I think there could be a balance of finding not as much density as a lot of previous proposals here, but still having enough that it really helps with the vibrancy to fuel people using this. And I agree, these are not the only people using this, but I think the analogy of folks living in the micro apartments using the Starbucks, if you will, here, or the food and beverage, they will be there. And part of the idea of the smaller housing is you don't spend all the time in your unit, you spend time on Wi-Fi, getting coffee, having a beer, being here and animating this place. And there's always a question, how many? But I think that would really work, and we could debate exactly the how many. I think the parking will also help dictate the how many pretty quickly.
Yeah.
How we feel about it. So the thought was you'd be able to access, like we had before somewhat, you'd be able to access in here with vehicles, and you'd be able to park underneath, let's say, half of this footprint on this side for covered parking like we talked about here. But it would still yield somewhat of a less proportion parking than the code probably currently says, unless we just want them to be really low buildings, which comes back to financing, may not make sense to build them. So we're thinking this is parking to the backside, residences probably on grade on this side, and then another level of residences on both sides. And maybe there's just 4 units per floor plate kind of thing, so everybody's got a corner unit. They're fairly narrow buildings, so unlike Willits, they'd actually be very wide, really nice spaces because they'd have a lot of frontage. Does that make sense to everybody? And then maybe there is a 3rd floor, but it's pulled back like we talked about before. And also in this plan, I think there's, depending on how we do it, there's probably ability to have more dimension from Two Rivers Road than the row house concepts, and there's more porosity shown than those earlier concepts a little bit.
And the idea with renting units, first of all, there's a high need. We see that at Willits with everything we open up. Secondly, in response to second homeowners and such, I don't ever see an example, I haven't seen an example of people renting for a year and not occupying their unit. Why would they rent it? They've got alternatives to that. So I think it cures that issue of a dormant residence or non-used residence.
Right, so this idea gets down to, hey, we're maybe just selling these.
Yeah.
Which is a big shift, and to me, just separately from all the politics here. I think you'll have more people here, more vibrancy, and I think that's a really good thing.
So Rich, I have a quick question. On the street side, on the zero setback side, have you thought about something that's like not residential on the first floor?
We have had that discussion.
Because it just seems,
Yep.
it just seems like it
Let
would
me
be
just-
better.
I'll just address that.
Sure.
I think some of us in an urban planning or town planning is probably a better term here, would say you want to line the street with commercial, non-residential on the ground floor. You could make that argument. You could also make the argument there's probably a limit from Tim's perspective of how much commercial he's going to build. Is that fair? And so we had the debate, is it here or is it here, for example? And which one energizes things better and is more synergistic with the other uses? We landed on maybe it's more synergistic here. The other thing is, I think this part of town, it's not a two-sided street. It's the
Right.
commercial core is tapering quickly. So I guess I could argue either way, but if you can't do both, I think having it here is a little stronger, and I think it energizes this more fully. We even debated, would you ever have a notion of, in the first phase, when you first build these, they're apartments, but the front 25 feet or 20 feet, which is those front units, could be converted to commercial if it made sense for the marketplace. Now, that would demand that it makes as much or more money, probably, and depending on how all that was arranged.
Yeah.
So it sounds a little funny. It's been done before.
We've seen
It's an option.
concepts, yeah. But we didn't go down that road, Jackie, in terms of conversion, because I didn't think it was likely to happen, and I didn't want to have it be, sort of
I just envisioned the first
an
floor,
idea
but
that
I
more, yeah.
also know how tough it's been for that one side of the commercial street here forever.
Which
It's
side
just
now?
like
What?
the side that
On
doesn't
Midland?
exist. The church,
Sure, yeah.
the church.
Yeah, where our office is. So I
Yeah.
totally agree. I think could you really get people in there? Is it really gonna work? It's always gonna be one-sided. It's still pretty vehicular here because people are driving into town. It's not as walkable as a lot of the rest of town. So I think the idea of providing for it long-term is an interesting concept. Could it ever grow into that? I mean, who knows how this is phased, by the way? I mean, so, you know, it could be that it's, so.
I mean,
we
maybe
have
it's a- maybe it's a
more-
destination, like a dry cleaner, something, you know, that we just don't have.
We have claimed more sidewalk on commercial frontage because of this piece here than what was before.
Yeah, and this is bigger, so in all, this is, you know, a bit bigger statement here in terms of the more energy here. I think it's really good. It feels much better, of course, in terms of the amount of scale to that.
We're assuming the visitor center be embedded within the community building. We haven't had thorough discussions, like Chris, about that, but also the public restrooms are needing to be part of that. And the public restrooms also part of the park, which hasn't even been developed as a site plan, but maybe that's it. And also for the restaurants, I think that building is a necessity for that piece. Okay?
I just looking through my notes, I mean, a couple of the points we made is to have this be a more organic place. So it's more casual, more eclectic, more diverse physically than the earlier sketches. And it basically has less density and less footprint as part of that. We've talked about focusing on it being for the locals. And to Jackie, to your point, our last meeting, and I think there's an acknowledgement we're selling it, but I think that, you know, I would be interested in buying one of these and, you know, downsizing, for example, to my river cabin. My daughter's gonna graduate this year. So I mean, and everything else here, I think, really is all about the locals, is the way I feel about it. The housing types we're talking about now are much smaller units and much more attainable than the previous proposal.
And micro units need to have a certain quantity to provide the amenities that are necessary. Those shared laundry rooms, things they can't have in their smaller spaces, shared parking, or shared car parking, and maybe, you know, game room, and oftentimes we see shared kitchen space for entertaining or meeting halls. You've got to have a certain bulk amount of units to support that financially. So, you know, I don't think we'd be wanting to look at this as, you know, can we go with 8 units or 6 units or some number that's pretty small from micros and that small housing. I think we'll be looking to use that building efficiently and then just temper it with a parking solution that we'll come back with.
So from an expectation management standpoint, we're not talking about 8 or 10 units.
Correct.
I don't think you can build that. So,
They'd be pretty lonely.
yeah, I mean, it might be, I'm just trying to break the ice. I mean, I think it's more like double that kind of thing. I think that's the right answer. I mean, these are 400 square foot studio apartments, and of course, there can be 2-bedroom versions and all these things. And part of the magic of it is there's enough of a community there that kind of fuels itself. And we went through, I had some stuff quickly researched today, things in New York and DC and all these other places, which are much larger projects. But the examples of how they have their common spaces, their common laundry room, that's where the pool table is, there's a real community building aspect to it. And I think this would be included in the community, that they're here and they're using this, et cetera. And I think these people certainly will be a part of that as well. You know, from a massing standpoint, your summary was very helpful. I think we're not doing anything here to really exceed where we were. I could see this building's a little bigger than what we had talked about, both in terms of its footprint and square footage and height, which I think is fine and the right answer. You know, it's 2 stories instead of 1, you know, whatever. And the site can totally handle, doesn't need any 1 story in my opinion. The art base has some tall 1-story kind of ideas that I think are cool and fit with this scale. I think this building would benefit from having a 3rd story, but it certainly could be pulled back where it mattered and appear to be 2 stories if that was really critical to you guys. And then these buildings, I think, are mostly 2 stories in here and 2 stories in this edge, and there would be some, you know, lofts in the roof, or sometimes a 3rd story should be considered. And that probably gets back to parking and politics, probably, in terms of how it all feels to you guys. But and we haven't developed, other than the previous one, we haven't gone through to kind of figure out those things. I got an instinct about it from the previous work, but okay. This is basically the same thing, just a little more. I don't even know, is it worth throwing this on the table? I think it is. So this is just the same bubbles, but shown with boxes more.
From bubbles to boxes.
To try to show, so the general thought was that there's a very, you know, unifying kind of pedestrian attitude to the whole place, if that makes sense. Cars are allowed to come into here, they do not come into here. And this is the community building that we've all talked about. It's got the Avante, if you will. That's part of the base of it. I love the idea of a shared event space. It could have co-working spaces here as well. This, no? Oh, I'm sorry, has the chamber, of course, has the chamber and the visitor center.
She's in.
Yeah, that chamber and visitor center would be here. It could also, and this was the art base. Again, broken into pieces, the idea of being able to walk through here, also walk through all these areas, and of course, walk through the bigger park system that we've talked about. This was the notion of the mixed-use building that had the maker spaces or the office spaces on the ground floor, energizing and connecting to this. This, to me, is kind of like a series of little pocket parks or something like that. Again, with them being able to roll out and even work outside, potentially, if they're an artist or something like that. And the art base could do the same. You could have an art gallery opening, we could have garage doors on both sides, people could be flowing through both sides. The workshops that happen here could open out onto their own terraces. All those kinds of ideas, I think, could be pretty exciting. We pulled a bunch of images, which I could pass around. I think we're running out of time. But these were all different maker spaces. One example is the Dairy Block down in Denver. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it's a new development. It's an infill development. And they did a whole, basically an alleyway that has maker spaces and food and beverage loading on all sides. It has a lot of art within it. Yeah, and that might be an example for something like this or this. This was the pool table in the laundry room of the micro hotel, micro apartments. This was an example of a micro apartment. It's still probably 400 square feet. This was another micro apartment.
Keep in mind that a fair number of people living in our hotels in this town are doing it on a permanent basis in 450 square feet.
This is the Source in Denver, which I hope you guys have been to. If you haven't, you should go check it out. It's in Rhino. And it's in an old industrial brick building, but they just built a hotel next to it. It's a pretty phenomenal space with food and beverage and a wine store and all kinds of different, so it's another version of an Avante, I guess.
And what's the name of that one?
This one is called The Source, and it's in Rhino. This is another kind of WeWork or shared space. It's as much lounge and Starbucks as it is a working space, but that's where a lot of work happens. If you guys haven't heard of the Dairy Block that I mentioned earlier, there's a new hotel that's part of the Dairy Block called the Maven. And the base of the Maven is another version of meet and greet, food and beverage, beyond Wi-Fi, and a lot of millennial action and venture capital, the guys meeting there.
Informal speed dating.
It's pretty awesome. So this is the Dairy Block. Let me see if I can, what else I can find here. So
This was
another version of
had
an
in
alley,
mind.
which is obviously more urban than we do here, but they could be very colorful, and the art base can help energize that. It would be one thought on both sides. This is a maker space, obviously. This is the Dairy Block that I was trying to find. So this is their gallery, or their alley. They have lighting and quite a great art installation. Then they have food and beverage and bars, and these garage doors all open up, and it's really pretty vibrant and pretty cool. And easy to see if you're down in Lodo. So, and I got an even bigger list if you want to keep seeing things down there. So, this was illustrating where the larger cottonwoods are, which I think are important, because having this be the most public stuff really fits, I think, very well within that kind of big landscape footprint. And this was the notion of letting cars in here, but having trees and hardscape that comes through that, again, feels much more about people than it does about cars.
And varying scale and not lined.
Less lined up and smaller footprints a little bit and some bigger gaps. And maybe there's even one that's literally a single-family little river cabin, or maybe it's two put together, but that kind of idea. We're working on a project in Telluride right now that's right downtown, and two previous design teams had worked on it and weren't successful in getting it approved. We were able to get it approved through the town of Telluride, which has a very strict historic committee. The big idea was taking the warehouse district and the residential district and merging them together. And what happened is we had a number of smaller buildings within this complex. We called them alley houses. And they're townhouses, and they are physically attached, but they look detached, and they look like the carriage houses you would see in the back of the alleys in Telluride. And we literally have open to the public alleys between the alley houses and the other bigger buildings we're doing. And it's all about fitting with the fabric of Telluride, and it's been very successful.
There's lots of alley houses in Denver.
Yeah, a lot of, yeah. And so I'm not saying these are alley houses, but I think the river cabin, river cottage, those kinds of analogies, I think maybe put something on it for us. And there's still 2 stories and maybe even have a loft in the roof or something, you know, so because they have to have a certain amount of density. And again, maybe there's 8 or 10 units here, kind of a thing, is what you and I talked about, and maybe those are 1,900 square feet or something like that, so they're smaller than we've talked about.
One stall garage on the front,
One-
even
yeah.
though they might be deep.
Right, maybe double deep, all those kinds of ideas.
Scale it down.
And then these guys would have some parking under, but they could also break down and scale like we talked about here, so they fit with the central business district scale of buildings and certainly aren't bigger than that.
Well, it appears that someone's been listening. I don't know where we're gonna try to get on this tonight at 9:30, quite honestly. What's your recommendation?
I think they just wanted to run through some of these sort of thoughts that they've been having, and I would assume you guys are getting pretty close to
Yeah.
kind of wrapping up. That was my
Yeah,
my take on it.
The only part that kind of comes out in some of these images, but the art base can be hugely important in terms of defining the character of the whole community, in terms of it being a strong art vibe, branding, and I think that meshes fine with River Cabin vibe over here too. So I think that's going to really become the draw, and how people will recognize this as a specific niche of downtown Basalt.
An enclave, or even talked about neighborhood, this is kind of one neighborhood. And one other thing I didn't mention is I think there needs to be a push towards diversity and eclecticism here. So it doesn't feel like it was all built at once, it wasn't one project, which is a real skill to get that to really work. It doesn't feel like it's one designer, you know, I think, and by the way, having other designers or out-of-town designers come in and critique, come up with other ideas, I think could be great. But I would agree with some of the conversation, you've got to kind of, what are you trying to get from them and how do you direct them so they can be effective? Because they could hear everything that's said and go, well, what are you really after? And there's always a financial layer too, so if they're doing it in a financial vacuum, it'll just be frustrating because they'll come up with all these great things and it won't make any sense. So these are some quick thoughts we thought responded to the discussions that have been happening since the last time we met and the ideas that have been germinating.
What's your thought about, so there's this active potential public piece, and then there's the art base, and then more active things over here of doing something on the edges of the art base, so it's, I don't want to call it a dead space in between, but it seems like that's not usually where the art thing is in between. It like, something has to hook it from one to the other.
Do you mean within the public space of the
Yes.
street, if you will, the
Yes.
pedestrian street between
The
the two?
street, the pedestrian
Well,
facing.
I think some of these examples are intriguing to me, in that there could be lighting that connects it together, there could be art animated in here, the food and beverage connecting out and having outdoor seating here as well as here could really
Okay.
work. The art base is what it is, but they do have, and I've been involved in the art base for a long time, so I wear a lot of hats here, but there is a lot of action and more than ever, and Jenna has crushed it in terms of the amount of programming and things we have going on. So there really,
11,000 people.
there really is a lot of action, and it spans all age groups and some demographic span for sure. And I think there's the art opening kind of side to it. There's all the students coming in at 3 o'clock. There's arts education for adults. And I think, one idea we were batting around, and we haven't talked to the art base about it, but would the art base have a deal with you, I guess, to have a couple of these units be artists in residence, and they could have art studios as part of the base of this or as part of this? And sometimes those big doors come up and people are wandering in and out of your gallery.
So remind me what these two are again?
So this was commercial space.
That's what that was
Floor, and
that's what I
the housing,
understood.
the micro housing, for lack of a better term, was above it. So if you had a couple artists in residence, at least the art base could organize, which they were intrigued with when we did that other design. Remember, Jackie had that in the design.
Right.
Maybe there's 2 units or 3 units. Here, you could have a couple of these units somehow as part of the deal. And they could have studios potentially integrated into that makerspace. Or it could be even studios incorporated into the art base, it's possible. I just see a lot of synergies there that could really be pretty exciting.
And the only other thing I was wondering is if you thought at all about swapping this with this, so that these commercial things are more connected to what is potentially the public commercial.
The main comment I made, I'll just repeat it, is because of the thought, we probably want some parking associated with the residential units above. And those kind of residential units probably can handle office below more than other kinds of residential units. It helps it to be here because you can access the parking from this side. It's, you know, in having kind of commercial energy around this, and, you know, our base is gonna need to work hard to be part of that, I think could work really well, so. And it's not like we're Denver or Manhattan, you know, it's not that anyway.
And maybe
So-
they could plug something on the edges, I don't know what, but
Yeah.
something commercially.
Yeah, well, they have art sales that they like to do. I mean, there's like a retail piece of the art base that could take a key corner. I mean, there's definitely ideas. They want to be part of it because it's a win-win for them to have more action around them, attract more people,
Yeah.
back and forth.
Okay.
And I feel very good about them delivering here.
Okay. So I'll go back to, I don't know where to send you from here. Did you have something, Jeff?
I was gonna say, I could do a quick recap, and then,
I was just
we'll have to
thinking
continue the public
process-wise.
hearing
Okay,
to,
let's just
our next
continue the
meeting.
public hearing.
And we can have one item after this, so sorry that you
Oh,
can't run.
jeez.
And
I know.
we'll collect what's on the table and make sure we get copies and stuff, and that they're entered as
Okay,
part of the public
first of all,
record.
you've done a lot of work. Like I said, it's obvious to me that there's been a lot of listening and work on this, on both the staff's part and your part and our part. So, I think we just need to continue this public hearing and get, like, the people back in to weigh in on this idea. I mean, I appreciate what you've,
Well, you
What you've
probably, I mean, you sketched these before you heard even more from us.
Right.
So, I mean, refining it a little bit would help understand it. I really appreciate this piece of it, because it's a lot different than what we saw at the end of August, so.
It's gonna take some trade-offs, parking.
Well, and I think we
Well,
need to
density.
look in, we need to be as innovative here as possible, but, you know, it's,
Yeah, I feel like this has been really valuable, and we did what we wanted to break the process, like fix the process a little bit. We do need the public to weigh in, but I like the direction, and I feel like we're potentially getting to something where all of us could agree.
I want to thank staff. I think that they were integral to countering when people would just ask me, am I done yet? And they were helpful to try and keep the enthusiasm and drive there and look for creative solutions. What we'll do from here as part of the next meeting is to further vet these concepts and make sure there's just more clarity about where this is going. But you start at this level and you start digging in deeper.
yeah, I can't give staff enough credit. Mahoney and the crew have just like banged so hard amongst themselves with us that this just doesn't happen with normal staffs.
I don't think we want to see this opportunity just dissipate. I think that you've all talked about that in different ways, and you know, can we keep going?
Yeah.
I think that was the vibe, that we didn't want to let it go and just disappear.
So I hate to break up this party, but I understand we have another item.
Not an agenda item, you alluded to something.
No, we have the resolution from Eagle County, for, Dixon County for the Whitewater Park.
Oh, okay, well, let
Yeah.
Jeff.
Can you grab all of that stuff?
Yeah, we need to let's do that first.
Okay, so this is still in a public hearing, so this will, unless there's a desire to have a special meeting between now and the next council meeting, which I don't think we've had any discussion on, this public hearing should be continued to the next regular council meeting, which is November 13th.
Right in front of him, and he's gonna do it.
Okay, Mayor, and just a couple other quick follow-up things, you know, based on this discussion, you know, we walked through several of the components of the application itself. The one that will probably require more discussion and more focused in on are the aspects of the residential breakdown, and, you know, I'm sure staff will work with Tim about kind of coming up with ranges and styles and designs to help kind of push that discussion a little forward. And then just wanted to again clarify that at the future, the continued public hearing, there could be an opportunity for public comment, certainly before any action of council.
Okay, Ryan, take it.
Mayor, I move to continue the public hearing to November 13th, 2018.
All in favor?
Aye. Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you guys for listening.
So do you need a resolution? We need a motion to approve.
Thank you.
I'll do it really quickly.
GoCo grant for the Whitewater Park.
They want to do is this for the GoCo grant? For the Whitewater Park?
Yeah.
I think we want to support this, because then it'll help.
Honestly, just make a motion because it wasn't in the packet, and so.
It's a resolution of the town council to support the Whitewater Park GoCo application
So
for
it's just
lottery
for,
funds.
we're just agreeing to submit an application to get money from.
We're just supporting their
Colorado.
application.
It's
Yeah.
for 350,000 is the.
But it's, we don't have to, we're not doing any money right now. It's all about just supporting the resolution. It's all about supporting their application.
And it's required by GoCo to get by.
We need to do this.
Could you make a motion
I make a
to,
motion to resolution of town council supporting the grant application for a local Parks and Outdoor Recreation grant from the State Board of the Great Outdoors Colorado Trust Fund for the expansion of the Picken County Healthy Rivers Whitewater Park.
and you said that was resolution 30, right?
Now I said it's resolution number 30.
Okay, is there a second? Any further discussion, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Great. Thanks, guys.
Be careful when you get out.
Oh, we are adjourned.
Almost killed myself.
Forgot about adjourned.
This is so funny.
I'm tired.
Yeah, but frankly, being able to sit at a table, it's a little